A 17-year-old kid pulls a blood-soaked leather patch from a rusted barbed wire fence in the middle of nowhere, Montana. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know whose blood stains the leather. He doesn't know that the man who wore it was buried 8 years ago, or that someone wants it back badly enough to kill for it. When he walks into a roadside diner full of outlaw bikers and holds it up for everyone to see, one veteran rider goes pale, because he personally carried the casket, and now the dead man's patch is dripping fresh blood. This story will change everything you think you know about brotherhood. Stay with me until the very end. If this hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from right now. Let's ride. The fence ran for nearly a quarter mile along the eastern edge of a property nobody had claimed in over a decade. Rusted wire sagged between posts that had gone soft with rot, leaning into each other like tired old men waiting to fall. Beyond it, brown grass stretched toward a tree line that looked more like a wall than a border, thick with pine and shadow even at midday. The county had stopped maintaining the road out here years ago. The gravel had surrendered to mud. The mud had surrendered to weeds, and now the weeds were tall enough to swallow a boy up to his waist if he wandered off the path. Eli Mercer was 17 years old and had been wandering off paths his entire life. He crouched beside a broken section of fence with a pair of wire cutters that were 2 sizes too big for his hands, twisting a replacement strand into place while the October wind tried to push him sideways. His jacket was too thin. His boots had a crack along the left sole that let in water every time the ground was soft. His knuckles were raw, split open in 3 places where the wire had bitten through his work gloves, and he hadn't bothered to clean the cuts because he had learned a long time ago that some things just bleed until they stop. He was getting paid $40 to repair 60 feet of fence. The rancher who owned the adjacent property had hired him through a handwritten note pinned to the board outside the Black Creek post office. No phone number, no name, just an address and a cash amount. Eli had walked 4 miles to get here because the bus didn't come this far out, and he would walk 4 miles back when the light died because nobody was coming to pick him up. Nobody had been coming to pick him up for a long time, 3 foster homes in 4 years. The first family had been decent enough until their own kid came back from college and needed the room. The second had collected the state checks and fed him whatever was cheapest and expired. The third had lasted 11 days before the father told him to stop making eye contact at the dinner table, and Eli had packed his bag before anyone asked him to leave because he had learned to read the architecture of rejection before it finished building itself around him. Now he was staying in a room above a closed hardware store that the county social worker had arranged as temporary housing, which in the language of the system meant permanent until someone noticed he existed again. The room had a mattress on the floor, a space heater that clicked but produced no heat, and a window that faced the parking lot of a laundromat. He ate what he could afford. He worked what he could find. He kept his head down and his mouth shut and his expectations somewhere below the floorboards where they couldn't trip him on the way out. The wire snapped. Eli swore under his breath and pulled his hand back, watching a thin line of blood rise across his palm. He pressed it against his jeans and looked at the section he had been working on. The old wire was too corroded to hold the splice. He would have to cut a longer piece and anchor it to the next post, which meant another 20 minutes of work and another set of cuts on hands that were already starting to swell. He reached for the roll of wire and stopped. Something was caught in the fence about 10 feet to his left, snagged between 2 rusted barbs where the wire crossed over itself in a twist that had probably been there since before he was born. At first he thought it was a piece of cloth, maybe torn from some animal that had tried to push through. But the color was wrong, too dark, too deliberate, and the texture was wrong too. Not fabric, but something heavier, something that had weight and grain and history. Eli set down his tools and walked over. It was leather. A piece of leather roughly the size of his hand, torn almost in half along a jagged line that followed no natural pattern. The edges were stiff and curled inward, and the surface was covered in something that had dried to a deep reddish brown that was too dark to be mud and too even to be rust. Blood. Old blood, but not old enough. Not 8 years in the weather old. Not sun-bleached and rain-washed and wind-scoured into nothing. This was weeks old, maybe less. dried hard but still holding its color, still carrying that faint metallic smell that Eli recognized from every split knuckle and busted lip he had ever earned. He pulled it free carefully, feeling the barbs resist and then release. The leather was heavier than he expected. He turned it over in his hands and saw stitching along one edge, precise, deliberate, the kind of needlework that meant someone had built this thing to last. And on the front, partially obscured by the blood, was an image. Symbol. Wings spread wide over a pair of crossed wrenches, with letters arcing above in a font that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that words could be weapons. Iron Saints. He had seen that name before, on the backs of jackets in parking lots, on stickers plastered to the window of a bar he walked past on his way to the post office, on the side of a black van parked permanently outside a body shop on Route 11 that everyone in Black Creek knew about but nobody talked about directly. The Iron Saints Motorcycle Club. Eli stood there in the dying light with blood on his hands and a dead man's patch in his grip, and he did what any 17-year-old with no family, no protection, and no understanding of what he was holding would do. He put it in his pocket and kept walking. The iron lantern sat on the shoulder of Route 11 like something the road had tried to shake off and failed. A low-slung building with a flat roof and windows so thick with grime that the neon beer signs behind them looked like smeared watercolors. The parking lot was half gravel, half cracked asphalt, and on any given evening it held more motorcycles than cars. Harleys mostly, a few Indians. All of them heavy, all of them loud, all of them parked in a row that suggested an order Eli didn't understand. He pushed through the front door at 6:47 in the evening, still wearing his work clothes, still carrying the wire cutters in his back pocket because he had nowhere else to put them. The warmth hit him first. Thick, heavy air that smelled like coffee and grease and something sharper underneath, like leather that had been worn too long and too hard. Then the sound, or rather the sudden absence of it. Conversation didn't stop when he walked in. It hesitated, paused at the edges of sentences, and waited to see what this was before deciding whether to continue. The diner was longer than it was wide, with a counter running along the left side and booths lining the right wall. A television mounted above the kitchen pass was showing a football game with the sound off. 3 men sat at the counter with their backs to the door, and none of them turned around. 2 more occupied a booth near the window, hunched over coffee cups that had been refilled enough times to leave rings on the table like tree stumps marking years. Eli walked to the counter and stood there because nobody offered him a seat. The woman behind the counter was maybe 50, with gray hair pulled back tight, and a face that had decided a long time ago to stop being surprised by anything. She looked at him the way people in Black Creek always looked at him, not with hostility exactly, but with the careful blankness of someone who had already decided he wasn't their problem. "Kitchen's closing in 20, she said. "I'm not here to eat." She waited. Eli reached into his pocket and pulled out the patch. He set it on the counter, blood side up, and the overhead fluorescent light caught the stain and made it look almost fresh. "I found this stuck in a fence out past Riddler Road," he said. "Figured somebody might have lost it." The woman behind the counter looked at the patch, and something changed in her face. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the kind of recognition that comes with memory, the sudden collision of the present with something that should have stayed buried. She took a step back from the counter without realizing she had done it. The 2 men in the booth near the window stopped talking. One of the men at the counter turned his head slowly, like a machine adjusting its angle of fire. He was big, not fat, but built in a way that suggested years of carrying weight that wasn't just physical. His beard was streaked with gray, and his hands were scarred across the knuckles in patterns that told stories no one would ever ask to hear. He wore a leather vest over a flannel shirt, and the vest carried patches of its own, the same winged insignia, the same crossed wrenches, the same letters that Eli had seen on the bloodied leather. He looked at the patch on the counter, then he looked at Eli. Then he looked at the patch again, and this time he didn't look away. From the last booth in the back, a man stood up. Gideon Cross moved like someone who had made a decision before his body caught up with it. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from years of riding and not enough meals, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than wood, and then left out in weather that never stopped. His hair was dark, cut short enough to show the scar that ran from behind his left ear down to the collar of his jacket. His eyes were the kind of gray that looked silver in bad light and black when he was angry. They were black now. He crossed the diner in 4 steps that sounded like a countdown, his boots hitting the floor with a rhythm that made the coffee cups rattle in their saucers. He stopped in front of Eli, and for a long moment he just stood there, looking down at the boy with an expression that was impossible to read, because it contained too many things happening at once: rage, grief, confusion, and something deeper that lived beneath all of them like groundwater. Then he looked at the patch. His hand reached out and touched it, and Eli saw the fingers trembling. Not shaking, trembling. The difference mattered. Shaking was fear. Trembling was something older, something that came from the bones rather than the blood. "Where did you find this?" 4 words, spoken quietly enough that only Eli and the woman behind the counter could hear them. But the silence in the diner was so total that the question carried to every corner of the room like smoke. Eli told him the fence on Riddler Road, the abandoned property, the rusted wire and the sagging posts and the piece of leather caught between barbs that should have eaten it to nothing years ago. Graves listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, he picked up the patch and held it under the light, turning it slowly, studying the tear pattern, the blood stain, the stitching along the edge. His jaw was set so tight that the muscles in his neck looked like cables. "How long have you been working out there?" Graves asked. 3 days. "And this wasn't there before?" "No, sir. I would have seen it. I worked that section yesterday morning. The wire was clean." Graves looked at the man at the counter who had turned around, and something passed between them that didn't require words. A language built from years of shared silence, shared roads, shared weight. The other man, stocky, bald, with a tattoo of a compass rose covering the back of his right hand, gave a single nod so small it could have been a muscle twitch. Graves turned back to Eli. "You need to leave." "I just wanted to return. I said leave." The words hit the air like a door slamming. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. The old familiar compression of being pushed out of a room he had barely entered. He had felt it so many times that it had its own texture now, its own weight, its own specific gravity. He nodded, turned, and walked toward the door. "Kid." Eli stopped. Graves hadn't moved. He was still standing at the counter, still holding the patch, but his voice had shifted. The hardness was still there, but something underneath it had cracked, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it gives way to whatever is moving beneath it. "You walk here?" "Yes, sir." "From where?" "Above the old hardware store on Main." "That's 4 miles." "I know." Graves looked at the patch in his hand, then at the boy in the doorway, and Eli could see the calculation happening behind those silver-black eyes, the measuring of risk against something else, something Eli didn't have a name for yet. "Sit down," Graves said. "Eat something. Then we'll talk." The woman behind the counter brought Eli a plate of food without asking what he wanted. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans from a can. The plate was hot, and the portions were large, and Eli ate without speaking because he had learned that silence was the safest currency in rooms full of strangers. He sat at the end of the counter, away from the other men, and kept his eyes on his plate while the diner slowly returned to a version of normal that felt like a held breath rather than a release. Graves sat in the booth at the back and made 3 phone calls in quick succession. His voice was too low to hear, but his body language told its own story. The rigid spine, the hand pressed flat against the table like he was holding something down, the way he kept looking at the patch propped against the salt shaker as if it might move on its own. The bald man with the compass tattoo, Eli would later learn his name was Deck, moved to the door and stood there with his arms crossed, watching the parking lot through the grime-streaked glass. He hadn't said a word since Eli walked in, but his presence at the door was a sentence in itself, punctuated by the weight of his shoulders and the stillness of his hands. 20 minutes later, 2 more motorcycles pulled into the lot. then a third, then two more after that, arriving in intervals that suggested phone trees and chain calls and the kind of mobilization that doesn't happen for casual reasons. They came in one at a time, men in leather vests and denim jackets, some of them with road dust still on their boots, some of them with sleep still in their eyes. A woman with short dark hair and a mechanic's build who moved through the room like she was measuring exits. Another man, older than the rest, who walked with a limp that favored his left side and carried a cane he clearly resented. Each of them saw the patch. Each of them stopped. And each of them looked at Graves with the same question Eli had already asked but hadn't received an answer to. What does this mean? Graves waited until there were 9 people in the room besides himself and Eli. Then he stood up. This is what the kid found. He held the patch up so everyone could see it. The overhead light caught the blood stain and painted shadows across the insignia, and in the silence that followed, Eli could hear the ice machine behind the counter cycling through its rhythm like a mechanical heartbeat. That's Silas, someone said. That's Silas, Graves confirmed. Silas is dead. I carried the box. The room absorbed this. Eli watched faces change without understanding what they were changing from or to. He saw grief flicker across the woman's expression like lightning behind clouds. He saw the old man with the cane close his eyes and keep them closed. He saw Deck's hands tighten at his sides until the knuckles went white. The blood is fresh, Graves said. Weeks, maybe less. The kid says it wasn't there yesterday. Someone put it on that fence between last night and this morning. Why? That's what we're going to find out. He looked at Eli then, and Eli felt the weight of it. Not judgment, not suspicion, something more complicated, the recognition of a variable that had entered an equation that was already impossible. What's your name, kid? Eli. Eli what? Mercer. You got family around here, Eli Mercer? No, sir. Friends? No, sir. Anyone who knows where you are right now? Eli shook his head. The question had a sharp edge to it that he was too tired to examine. He had walked 4 miles, repaired 30 feet of fence, found something that made a room full of dangerous men go silent, and now he was sitting in a diner at 7:30 on a Wednesday night eating the first hot meal he'd had in 3 days. His capacity for analysis was limited. Anyone who would notice if you didn't come home tonight? The question hung in the air like a held knife. Eli looked at Graves and understood, with the clarity that comes only to those who have been unwanted long enough to develop it, that this wasn't about concern. It was about exposure. No, Eli said. Nobody would notice. Graves nodded slowly. The calculation behind his eyes was visible now, gears turning in the complicated machinery of a man who had spent decades balancing violence with caution and loyalty with survival. Then you're staying here tonight, Graves said. There's a room above the kitchen. Lock on the door, clean sheets. You don't leave until I come get you in the morning. I don't. This isn't a request. Eli felt the compression again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the feeling of being pushed out. It was the feeling of being held in place, of someone drawing a line around him and deciding that whatever was inside that line mattered enough to protect. He didn't know how to name it because no one had ever done it before. He just nodded. The meeting continued after the woman behind the counter, her name was June, led Eli upstairs to a small room with a single bed, a nightstand, and a window that looked out onto the back lot where the motorcycles sat in a line of chrome and black paint. He lay on the bed without taking off his boots and stared at the ceiling and listened to the voices below him, too muffled to make out words but clear enough to hear the tone. Urgency, anger, fear. These were sounds Eli knew. He had heard them through foster home walls and school hallway doors and the thin partitions of county offices where people decided his future without asking his name. But there was something else in these voices that he didn't recognize, something that sounded like a wire being pulled tighter and tighter until it either held or snapped. Below him, Graves was laying out everything he knew. Silas Kane had been an Iron Saint for 15 years, a founding member's son, a writer who had earned every patch through blood, sweat, and the kind of quiet loyalty that didn't need to announce itself because it was visible in everything he did. He was the one who fixed the bikes nobody else could figure out. He was the one who sat with the grieving widows after funerals while everyone else went to the bar. He was the one who drove through a blizzard to bring insulin to an elderly neighbor who wasn't even a member but who lived on the same road as the clubhouse. 7 years ago, Silas had started asking questions about a trucking operation running loads through the county, livestock transport on paper, refrigerated trailers moving cattle from processing facilities to distribution centers across 3 states. Everything legal, everything documented, everything perfectly clean on the surface. But Silas had noticed things that didn't add up. Trailers running at night when no legitimate operation needed darkness. Routes that bypassed major highways in favor of unmarked county roads. Drivers who rotated on schedules that made no sense unless the purpose was to prevent anyone from getting familiar enough with the cargo to ask questions. He had brought his concerns to the club. Graves had told him to let it go. The Iron Saints didn't start wars. They couldn't finish. And whatever was moving through those trailers belonged to people with resources that made the club's entire operation look like a lemonade stand. Silas had nodded. He had said he understood. And then he had done exactly what Graves feared he would do. He had gone looking on his own. 6 months later, the warehouse on Route 7 caught fire. The blaze was hot enough to melt steel and fast enough to consume everything inside before the volunteer fire department could do more than protect the adjacent buildings. The official report called it an electrical malfunction. Insurance paid out. The property was demolished and the lot was sold and the grass grew over the foundation, and the county moved on because counties always move on. They found what they were told were Silas's remains in the wreckage. Dental records confirmed the identification. A funeral was held. Graves had stood at the front of the chapel with his hands clenched at his sides and dirt under his fingernails from digging the grave himself, because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. He had lowered the box into Montana earth and thrown the first handful of dirt and walked away without crying because he had promised himself a long time ago that he would save his tears for something that deserved them. And now, a 17-year-old kid with split knuckles and no winter coat had walked into his diner carrying the dead man's patch, and the blood on it was fresh. Graves looked at the faces around the room. 9 people who had mourned Silas Kane. 9 people who had carried that loss in the specific way that bikers carry loss. Silently, deeply, like an engine knock they learned to ride with because stopping isn't an option. "Someone planted that patch," Deck said. "Agreed. Which means someone had it. Which means the fire wasn't what we thought it was." The woman, her name was Stone, and she had earned it, leaned forward. "You're saying Silas is alive?" "I'm saying the blood on his patch is fresh. I'm saying someone put it on a fence where a kid would find it. I'm saying none of that is consistent with a man who's been dead and buried for 7 years. 8, the old man with the cane corrected quietly. 8 years. The room went silent. Graves pulled out his phone and opened a map application. "I'm going out to the fence at dawn. Deck, Stone, you're with me. Everyone else stays visible. Normal routines. Nothing changes until we know what we're dealing with." "And the kid?" Deck asked. Graves looked at the ceiling as if he could see through it to the room where Eli Mercer lay staring at shadows, wearing boots with cracked soles on clean sheets that smelled like detergent, thinking whatever thoughts a 17-year-old thinks when the silence around him is different from every other silence he has known. "The kid stays," Graves said. "He's the only one who knows exactly where that patch was. And if whoever put it there is watching, he's also the only one they've seen take it." The words settled over the room like a cold draft. Eli Mercer had walked 4 miles to return a piece of leather he didn't understand, and now he was sitting at the center of something that had been buried for 8 years, something that someone wanted to stay buried. And upstairs, lying on a bed that wasn't his, in a room that wasn't his, in a building full of people he didn't know, Eli pressed his palm against the cut the wire had left and felt his own heartbeat against the wound. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle engine turned over in the darkness. Then another. Then a third. None of them belonged to anyone inside the Iron Lantern. Graves heard them. He stood up from the table and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the parking lot. 3 sets of headlights sat at the far end of the gravel, idling, not approaching, not leaving, just sitting there in the cold, engines rumbling like a conversation held at a distance too great for words. "We've got company," Graves said quietly. Deck was already moving toward the door. "No." Graves held up one hand. "Nobody goes outside. Not yet." "They know," Stone said. Graves let the curtain fall back into place. "They know someone found it," he said. "They don't know what we know. That's the only advantage we have right now." He turned and looked at each person in the room, and in the dim light of the iron lantern, with the television still playing a football game nobody was watching, and the coffee going cold in cups nobody was drinking, Gideon Graves Cross made a decision that would define every hour that followed. Nobody talks about this outside this room. Nobody rides alone, and nobody goes near that fence until I say so. He paused. Because if Silas Kane is alive, then someone went through a lot of trouble to make us believe he was dead. And people who fake a man's death don't do it to protect him. The 3 headlights outside held their position for another 4 minutes. Then, one by one, they pulled away. Slow, deliberate. Each departure spaced exactly 30 seconds apart, like a countdown running in reverse. By the time the last engine faded into the Montana night, the temperature inside the iron lantern had dropped to something that had nothing to do with weather. And upstairs, Eli Mercer finally closed his eyes, unaware that the piece of leather he had pulled from a rusted fence that afternoon had just put a target on his back that no amount of walking could outrun. Eli woke to the sound of boots on stairs, not climbing, descending, heavy, deliberate, each step carrying the kind of weight that had nothing to do with body mass. He lay still on the bed with his eyes half open, watching the gray light push through the window like it wasn't sure it wanted to be here either. The room smelled like old wood and cleaning solution and something faintly metallic that he realized was his own dried blood from the cuts on his knuckles. The door opened without a knock. Graves stood in the frame, fully dressed, leather vest over a black thermal, his jaw set in a line that looked like it had been there all night. His eyes swept the room the way a man checks a perimeter. Corners first, then the window, then the boy on the bed. "Get up," he said. "We leave in 10. "Where are we going?" "You're going to show me exactly where you found it." Eli sat up and swung his legs off the mattress. His back ached from sleeping in his boots. His hands throbbed. The cut across his palm had sealed itself overnight into a dark line that looked like a sentence written in a language he couldn't read. "I need to get my tools," he said. "I left them at the fence." "Your tools will be there. Get up." Graves turned and disappeared down the stairs, and Eli heard the creak of the floorboards absorb his footsteps like the building was swallowing him whole. The parking lot was still dark. 5:40 in the morning, and the sky above Black Creek was the color of wet concrete, heavy with clouds that sat low enough to press against the tree line. 2 motorcycles were already running. Dex and a bike Eli hadn't seen before. A flat black Road King with no chrome and no markings, stripped down to function the way a weapon is stripped down to purpose. Stone stood beside it, zipping a jacket that was heavier than anything Eli owned, her breath coming in short white bursts that disappeared before they had time to form. A truck was parked beside the bikes. Old Chevy, dark green, rust along the wheel wells. Graves pointed at it with his chin. "You ride with me." Eli climbed into the passenger seat. The cab smelled like coffee and motor oil and cold leather, and there was a thermos in the cup holder that Graves hadn't offered to share. The engine turned over with a cough, and then settled into a low rumble that vibrated through the bench seat and into Eli's spine. They drove in silence. The road out to Riddler was empty. No other vehicles, no lights in the farmhouses they passed, no signs of life except a pair of crows sitting on a power line like punctuation marks in a sentence nobody had finished. Deck and Stone followed on their bikes, the sound of their engines filling the space behind the truck, like a wall being built one brick at a time. Eli watched the fence appear in the headlights. It looked different in the dark, longer, more broken, the posts tilting at angles that suggested something beneath the ground had shifted. He pointed. "There. 3rd post from the end of the splice I was working on. between the top two wires where they cross. Graves stopped the truck and killed the engine, but left the headlights on. He sat for a moment staring through the windshield at the fence as if it owed him something. Then he reached under the seat and pulled out a flashlight. Heavy, metal, the kind that could crack a skull if the situation required it, and stepped out. The cold hit Eli when he opened his door. Deep October cold that went through his jacket and his shirt and his skin and settled somewhere between his ribs like a fist. He walked to the fence and stopped at the exact spot where he had found the patch, the barbs still bent outward from where he had pulled the leather free. Graves crouched. He ran the flashlight beam along the wire across the post, down to the ground. His movements were slow, methodical, the practiced patience of a man who had learned that the things most likely to kill you are the things you don't bother to look at twice. "Here," he said. Eli looked where the beam was pointing. In the soft earth at the base of the post, partially hidden by dead grass and fallen leaves, there were tire tracks, motorcycle tires. The tread pattern was crisp, defined, pressed deep enough into the soil to suggest the bike had been stationary for a while. Someone had parked right next to the fence, probably in the dark, probably quickly. Deck knelt beside the tracks and pulled out a phone. He took photographs from 3 angles, then used a stick to measure the width of the tread. "Not a Harley," he said. Graves looked at him. "Narrower tire, sport bike maybe, or a metric cruiser, something lighter. Iron Saints don't ride metric." "No," Deck said. "They don't?" Stone was walking the fence line in the opposite direction, her flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn gray like a blade. She stopped 50 feet out and called back without raising her voice, trusting the silence to carry it. "Graves, come look at this." They found the second mark near a section of fence that had collapsed entirely, the posts fallen flat, and the wire coiled in the grass like dead snakes. In the mud beside the wreckage, someone had scratched a series of numbers into the earth with a stick or a knife. 3 lines of digits, deep enough to survive at least one rainfall, arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to Eli but made Graves go completely still. He stared at the numbers for a long time. "Those are coordinates," Stone said quietly. Graves didn't respond. He pulled out his phone and entered the digits, and Eli watched the screen reflect in his eyes. A map loading, zooming, resolving into a location that was 32 miles northwest, past the county line, in a part of Montana that Eli had never been to and never had reason to visit. "Do you know what's out there?" Deck asked. "Nothing," Graves said. "That's the point." He stood up and pocketed the phone and looked at Eli with an expression that the boy was beginning to recognize. It wasn't trust. It wasn't suspicion. It was the careful, measured assessment of a man deciding how much weight to put on a bridge before he knew whether it would hold. "You need to go back to town," Graves said. "I still have 40 feet of fence to finish." "The fence doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me. That's $40. Something shifted in Graves's face. A micro-expression that passed too quickly to name, but left a residue that softened the architecture of his jaw by exactly 1 degree. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded bill. He held it out. "Take it." "I didn't earn it." "Kid, you pulled a dead man's patch out of a barbed wire fence and walked it into a room full of strangers who could have hurt you for knowing about it. You've earned more than $40. Eli looked at the money. A $100 bill, creased down the middle, worn soft at the edges. He didn't take it. "I don't want money for doing the right thing," he said. "I want to know what's going on." Graves lowered his hand. He looked at Deck. Deck shrugged, a gesture so minimal it was almost theoretical. "What's going on," Graves said slowly, "is none of your business. And the smartest thing you can do right now is walk back to that room above the hardware store and forget every single thing that's happened since yesterday afternoon." "You said someone might be watching me." "I said you're the only one they've seen take the patch. So sending me back alone is safer?" The question landed. Eli watched it hit Graves square in the chest, watched the man absorb it the way a wall absorbs a punch, without moving, without cracking, but with the faintest vibration running through the structure that told you the force had been received. Graves turned to Stone. "Take him back to the Iron Lantern. Stay with him." "I'm not a babysitter." "I'm not asking you to babysit. I'm asking you to make sure nobody puts a 17-year-old in a ditch over something he doesn't understand." Stone looked at Eli, then back at Graves. Whatever passed between them was private, encrypted in a history that Eli had no key to decode. Then she nodded once and walked toward her bike. "Come on, kid. You ride behind me." Eli had never been on a motorcycle. The seat was harder than he expected, the engine louder, the wind colder. He held on to the passenger grips because Stone hadn't offered anything else, and by the time they reached the diner, his fingers were numb and his eyes were watering, and something in his chest felt like it was either opening or breaking, and he couldn't tell which. Stone parked the bike and led him inside without speaking. June was already behind the counter, coffee brewing, the television on with the sound still off. The diner was empty except for the old man with the cane, who sat in the same booth as the night before with a cup of tea and a newspaper he wasn't reading. "Sit," Stone said, pointing at the counter. Eli sat. Stone went behind the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one to Eli without asking if he drank it. He wrapped his hands around the cup and let the heat work its way into his knuckles, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the coffee maker gurgling and the old man turning a page he hadn't looked at. "What was his name?" Eli asked. Stone didn't answer immediately. She stood with her back against the kitchen wall, both hands wrapped around her own cup, watching the parking lot through the window with the practiced attention of someone who had been trained to see threats before they assembled. "Silas Kane," she said finally. "He was one of us." "And he died?" "We buried him." "But the blood. I know about the blood." Silence. The coffee maker finished its cycle and clicked off. The old man turned another page. "He was good," Stone said, and the words sounded different in her mouth than it would have in anyone else's. Not soft, not sentimental. She said it the way a soldier says a weapon is reliable, as a statement of function rather than affection. "He fixed things. Engines mostly, but other things too. People. Situations. He was the one you called when something was broken, and you didn't know where to start." "How did he die?" "Fire. A warehouse out on Route 7. They said it was electrical. We found what was left of him. Dental records matched." "But you don't believe that anymore." Stone looked at him. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they carried the kind of depth that comes from seeing things that can't be unseen. She set her coffee cup down on the counter with a sound that was softer than Eli expected. "I believed it for 8 years, she said. "That's a long time to carry a funeral." The old man in the booth spoke without looking up from his newspaper. His voice was thin, but precise, like a blade that had been sharpened so many times there was almost nothing left. The dental records were provided by the county coroner's office, same office that processed the fire report, same office that signed off on the insurance claim. Stone and Eli both turned to look at him. "Name's Harlan," the old man said, still not looking up. "And I've been waiting 8 years for someone to say what I've been thinking since the day we put that box in the ground." "Which is what?" Stone asked. Harlan finally looked up. His eyes were pale blue, faded like denim left in the sun, but behind them something was burning with the quiet intensity of a pilot light that had never been extinguished. "The box was too light," he said. "A man's remains, even after a fire that hot, carry weight. Bone doesn't disappear. It calcifies. It compresses. It becomes something harder than what it was before the fire touched it. I carried one end of that casket, and I carried my brother's casket in 1987, and the weight was wrong." The room held its breath. "You never said anything," Stone said. "I said it to Graves, the night after the funeral. He told me grief makes you look for reasons where there are none. He told me to let it go." "And you did?" "I let it go the way you let go of a rope burn. You open your hand, but the scar stays." Eli listened to this exchange with the focused attention of someone who had spent his life reading rooms. The tension between Stone and Harlan wasn't anger. It was the particular strain that comes when two people realize they have been carrying the same doubt in separate silence, each one believing they were alone with it. The front door opened. A man walked in that Eli hadn't seen before. Tall, angular, wearing a leather jacket that was newer and cleaner than anything the Iron Saints wore, without patches or markings of any kind. His hair was sandy and cut in a way that suggested a barber rather than a bathroom mirror. His boots were polished. His jeans had creases. He looked wrong in this room, the way a screwdriver looks wrong in a drawer full of knives. He walked to the counter and sat 2 stools down from Eli without acknowledging anyone. June appeared from the kitchen and stopped. Something crossed her face. Not fear, but a careful, deliberate blankness that Eli recognized because he had spent years perfecting the same expression. "Coffee," the man said. June poured it. Her hand was steady. She set the cup down and retreated to the kitchen without offering cream or sugar. Stone hadn't moved from her position against the wall, but everything about her had changed. Her weight had shifted forward. Her right hand had dropped to her side, fingers loose, ready. The air around her had compressed into something dense and watchful. The man sipped his coffee. He looked at the television, at the football highlights playing silently above the kitchen pass. Then he looked at Eli. "You're the one who found it," he said. It wasn't a question. Eli didn't answer. He had learned from years of foster care intake meetings and school counselor interrogations and police welfare checks that silence is the only response that can't be used against you. The man smiled. It was a careful smile, constructed rather than felt, assembled from the correct arrangement of muscles without any of the underlying architecture that makes a smile mean something. "I work for the company that owned the warehouse on Route 7, he said. "The one that burned down. We've been doing an insurance review, routine stuff, but some items were never accounted for, and we've been looking into recovery." "You're in the wrong place," Stone said from the wall. The man didn't turn to look at her. He kept his eyes on Eli. "Am I?" "There's nothing here that belongs to your company." "That's funny, because a colleague of mine was driving past Riddler Road last night and saw a young man pulling something out of a fence, something that looked a lot like company property." The lie was smooth, professional, delivered with the kind of practiced ease that comes from telling lies for a living. But Eli had spent his childhood surrounded by liars, social workers who said placements were temporary, foster parents who said they cared, teachers who said things would get better. And he knew the sound of a lie the way a mechanic knows the sound of a bad bearing. You don't have to understand the engineering to know something is wrong. "I found a piece of trash in a fence," Eli said. "Threw it away." The man's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. A recalculation, a micro-adjustment in the machinery of his expression that told Eli the answer wasn't what he expected. "That's unfortunate," the man said. "It had sentimental value." "Trash usually does. To somebody." The man finished his coffee. He set the cup down with a precise click, placed a $5 bill on the counter, and stood. He buttoned his jacket with both hands, a gesture that was oddly formal, like a lawyer adjusting his suit before closing arguments. "If it turns up," he said, "my company would be very grateful, generous even, especially to someone in your situation." The last 2 words carried a weight that had nothing to do with generosity. Eli felt them land against his chest like a finger pressing on a bruise. Someone in your situation, someone alone, someone without protection. Someone who could disappear from a room above a hardware store and nobody would file a report for weeks. "I think you should leave," Stone said. The man finally turned to look at her. His eyes moved across her face, down to her hands, and back up. The calculation was visible, the same kind of risk assessment that Graves performed, but executed with a different kind of intelligence. Colder, more corporate, less concerned with the outcome for anyone but himself. "I'm just having coffee," he said. "You've had it. The door's behind you." He looked at Stone for 3 seconds, then at Harlan in the booth, then at Eli. Then he turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang once. Through the window, Eli watched him cross the parking lot to a black SUV with tinted windows and no plates. He climbed in and sat there for a long moment, looking at the diner. Then the SUV pulled away slowly, turning left onto Route 11 in the direction nobody in Black Creek drove unless they were going somewhere that didn't want to be found. Stone moved to the window and watched until the vehicle disappeared. "Deck," she said, pulling out her phone. "We've got a problem." She described the man, the jacket, the SUV, the no plates, the story about insurance and company property. Her voice was flat and controlled, but the speed of her words betrayed something underneath, urgency pressing against discipline like water pressing against a dam. "He knew about the kid," she said. "He knew about the fence. He knew about last night." She listened for a moment, then hung up without saying goodbye. "Harlan," she said. The old man was already standing, his cane in one hand, his tea abandoned on the table. He moved with the slow deliberation of someone who understood that speed was no longer his weapon, but precision still was. "I'll call the network," he said. "If that vehicle crosses county lines, we'll know within the hour." He walked to the back of the diner and through a door that Eli hadn't noticed before, and the sound of his cane on the floor faded into the building like a heartbeat retreating into a chest. Stone turned to Eli. "Who are you staying with?" "Nobody." "Who's your social worker?" "Her name's on a file I haven't seen in 4 months." "School?" "Enrolled. Haven't been in 2 weeks." Stone absorbed this. Her expression didn't change, but something in the musculature of her face performed a rearrangement so subtle it was almost invisible. The tiniest softening around her eyes, the faintest release of tension in her jaw. "How old are you?" she asked, though she already knew. 17. "And nobody is looking for you." "People don't look for things they never wanted in the first place." The sentence sat in the air between them. Stone picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. "You're wrong about that," she said. "Sometimes they just don't know where to start." She looked out the window again. The parking lot was empty now. The sky was getting lighter, but the clouds were still low and heavy, and the light that pushed through them was the color of dishwater. "You can't go back to that room above the hardware store," she said. "That's the only place I have. That's the only place they know you have. That man knew your situation. He knew you were alone. He knew where to find you. That means someone's been watching you since before you found that patch." The implication hit Eli like cold water. Not since yesterday, since before. Someone had been watching the fence. Someone had known he was working there. Someone had placed the patch where a 17-year-old kid doing manual labor would find it. And now that same someone was sending men in clean jackets and polished boots to retrieve it. He wasn't a witness. He was bait. 2 hours later, Graves returned. He came through the back door instead of the front, which told Eli everything about how the morning had gone. His boots were muddy up to the ankles. His face carried the particular shade of exhaustion that comes from discovering something you didn't want to find. Stone met him in the hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. Eli could hear their voices but couldn't make out words, just the rhythm. The cadence of information being transferred at high speed between two people who had done this before. Then Graves came into the dining room and looked at Eli. "The coordinates in the dirt," he said. "They're real. They point to an old livestock processing facility past the county line, a place called Greyhorn Station, shut down 12 years ago. County records say it's been abandoned ever since." But it's not. No. Fresh tire tracks. Heavy vehicles, trailer ruts. Someone's been running loads through that place recently. The fencing around the property has been repaired and reinforced. New locks on the gates, security cameras on the perimeter. He sat down in the booth across from Eli and placed both hands flat on the table. His fingers were spread wide, knuckles swollen, the veins standing out like river systems on a topographic map. "Stone told me about the visitor," he said. "He knew about me. He knows about all of us. That's what money buys, information." "Who is he?" "I don't know yet, but the jacket was wrong. The boots were wrong. The story about insurance was wrong. People who recover company property don't drive unmarked vehicles to roadside diners at 6 in the morning to threaten teenagers." Graves leaned back and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. When he dropped them, the gray in his irises looked almost transparent, like glass worn thin. "There's something else," he said. "The coordinates. They weren't scratched in the dirt like someone was leaving a message in a hurry. The strokes were deliberate, precise, made by someone who knew exactly what they were writing and who they were writing it for. "Silas," Stone said from the doorway. "Silas," Graves confirmed. He left the patch as a signal and the coordinates as a map. He knew one of us would come looking. "So, he's alive." The words filled the room like pressure filling a container. Graves didn't answer immediately. He sat there with his hands on the table and his eyes focused on something that wasn't in the room. A memory, maybe, or a promise, or the weight of 8 years spent believing a lie he had helped build the funeral around. "If he's alive," Graves said, "then someone kept him alive for a reason, and whatever that reason is, it's connected to whatever's running through Greyhorn Station right now." The phone behind the counter rang. June answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and hung up without speaking. She walked to the dining room doorway and looked at Graves. "Harlan's contact tracked the SUV," she said. "It crossed the county line 20 minutes ago, heading northwest, toward Greyhorn. Straight line." Graves stood up. The chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a match striking. "We go tonight," he said. "Stone, Deck, and me. Reconnaissance only. We need to see what's inside that facility before we make any moves." "And the kid?" Stone asked. "The kid stays here. Harlan watches him." Eli stood up too. His chair didn't scrape because he hadn't been sitting long enough to settle into it. His body was wired, electric, running on adrenaline and cold coffee and the specific energy that comes from being the smallest person in a room full of people making decisions about your life. "I want to come." "No. I found the patch. I found you. I'm the reason any of this is happening. And that's exactly why you stay. You're going to lock me in a room while people who already know my face drive around in cars with no plates looking for something I touched? How's that safer?" Graves looked at him with the full force of his attention, and Eli felt it like standing in front of a truck's headlights on a dark road. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Nothing to do but stand there and let the light hit you. "Because I can't do what I need to do out there if I'm worrying about you in here," Graves said. "That's not a compliment. It's a liability assessment. I've been a liability my whole life. I'm used to it." Something crossed Graves's face that Eli had never seen on an adult before. Not pity, not anger, not the patronizing tolerance that foster parents wore like a uniform. It was recognition. The sudden, jarring understanding that the person in front of you knows something about survival that you didn't teach them and can't take away. Graves sat back down. "How many foster homes?" he asked. 3. "How many of them were worth a damn?" 0. "And the room above the hardware store?" "County placement, temporary." "How long?" 7 months. Graves absorbed this. 7 months of temporary. 7 months of a mattress on a floor and a space heater that didn't work and a window facing a laundromat parking lot and nobody checking in and nobody checking out and a 17-year-old boy repairing fences for $40 because the system that was supposed to protect him had decided he wasn't worth the paperwork. "You stay," Graves said, and his voice was different now, quieter, not softer. Graves didn't do soft, but lower. The way an engine sounds when it shifts from overdrive to something that can sustain itself for the long haul. "Not because you're a liability, because the only way I can guarantee you survive this is if I know exactly where you are every second until it's over." Eli opened his mouth to argue. "That's not negotiable," Graves said, "and it's not temporary." The word landed differently than it ever had before. Eli heard it and felt something move inside his chest, some structural shift in the architecture of expectation he had built over 17 years of being left behind. He didn't understand it yet. He wouldn't understand it for a long time, but he felt it the way you feel the first crack in a wall before you see the light coming through. He sat down. Night came slowly to Black Creek, the way it always did in October, the light bleeding out of the sky one shade at a time until the world was the color of iron and the air tasted like cold metal. Graves, Deck, and Stone left at 9:15, 2 bikes and the green Chevy, heading northwest on roads that didn't appear on the county maps Eli had seen pinned to the wall of the post office. Harlan sat in his booth with a shotgun propped against the wall beside him, hidden behind the angle of the bench. June locked the front door and turned off the neon signs, and the diner went dark except for a single light above the kitchen pass that cast everything in a yellow glow that made the room look like the inside of an old photograph. Eli sat at the counter and waited. He had been waiting his entire life, in hallways, in offices, in rooms that were never his. But this was different. This waiting had teeth. It had direction. It had the particular quality of time passing when you know that somewhere in the darkness, people are moving towards something that could change everything or end everything. And the only thing separating the two outcomes is decisions being made by people you barely know. At 11:47, Harlan's phone buzzed. The old man looked at the screen. His expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the cane until Eli could see the tendon standing out beneath the skin. "They found the facility," Harlan said. "And? It's not abandoned. It's operational. Transport trailers, security, armed personnel, and surveillance footage going back years." Harlan paused. He looked at Eli with those pale blue eyes that held everything and revealed nothing. "They found footage of Silas," he said. "Recent footage. He's alive. He's inside the compound, and he's not there by choice." Eli felt the counter beneath his hands, solid and cold and real. He felt the coffee cup against his fingers. He felt the air in his lungs and the heartbeat in his wrists and the cut across his palm that was still healing from a piece of wire on a fence that had led to a dead man who wasn't dead. "There's something else," Harlan said. "Graves found evidence of what they're transporting. It's not livestock." The old man's voice didn't waver. His hands didn't shake. But something in his eyes went flat and hard, the way a lake freezes over in a single night when the temperature drops below zero and the water doesn't even have time to ripple before it turns to ice. "It's people," Harlan said. "They're trafficking people through that facility, and they've been doing it for years." The silence that followed was absolute. And then Harlan's phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen, and this time his face did change. The color left it. The steadiness left it. The 8 years of quiet patience that had held him together since a funeral that felt wrong dissolved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "What?" Eli said. Harlan looked up. "They've been spotted," he said. "The facility went to lockdown. Graves and the others are surrounded and they can't get out." The phone went silent. The diner went silent. The whole town of Black Creek went silent, as if the darkness outside had finally found a way inside and was holding its breath. And Eli Mercer, 17 years old, no family, no protection, no one who would notice if he disappeared, stood up from the counter and looked at the shotgun leaning against the wall of Harlan's booth, and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that the only people who had ever tried to keep him safe were now trapped inside a compound full of armed men 32 miles away. And there was no one left to call. Eli didn't reach for the shotgun. He wanted to. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to grab it, to run outside, to do something, anything, other than stand in a dark diner at midnight while 3 people who had treated him like a human being for the first time in his life were trapped inside a compound full of armed men. But he didn't reach for it because Harlan was already on his feet, cane in one hand, phone in the other, and the look in the old man's eyes was not the look of someone who needed a 17-year-old to save anyone. It was the look of a man who had been waiting 8 years for the war to start and was furious that it had started without him. "Sit down," Harlan said. "We have to sit down." The command was quiet, but carried a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Harlan had been a founding member's brother-in-law. He had ridden with the Iron Saints before Eli was born, before his hip went bad, before the cane, before the years piled up like snow on a fence post until the post disappeared beneath them. He didn't give orders anymore, but when he did, the architecture of those orders was built on foundations that nobody in the club had ever questioned. Eli sat. Harlan dialed a number, then another, then a third. Each call lasted less than 30 seconds. He spoke in fragments, Grid coordinates, vehicle descriptions, timestamps, and each person on the other end understood without asking for clarification because this was a language they had built over decades, stripped down to essentials the way combat strips communication down to what keeps you alive. When he finished, he looked at June. "Get the truck keys," he said. "The one out back, not the Chevy." June disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a set of keys on a ring that had no fob, no tag, nothing to identify what they belonged to. She handed them to Harlan without a word, but her hand lingered on his for a moment longer than necessary, and in that brief contact, Eli saw something pass between them that was older and deeper than the crisis unfolding around them. "You," Harlan said, pointing his cane at Eli, "you're coming with me." "You just told me to sit down." "That was before I made 3 phone calls. The situation has changed. Get your jacket." "I don't have a jacket, not a real one." Harlan looked at him the way you look at a leaking pipe, not with judgment, but with the practiced assessment of someone calculating how long something can hold before it fails. He turned to June. "Silas's old coat, the one in the storeroom." June hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely visible, the kind that happens when a request touches something that has been preserved, not because it's useful, but because throwing it away would mean accepting something that you're not ready to accept. "June." She went. She came back with a canvas jacket lined with fleece, dark brown, worn soft at the elbows and cuffs. It was too big for Eli by at least 2 sizes, but when he put it on, the weight of it settled over his shoulders like a hand pressing him into the ground, steadying him, anchoring him, holding him in place against a wind that hadn't started blowing yet. It smelled like motor oil and cold air and something else, something human. The residue of a man who had worn it long enough for the fabric to learn the shape of his body and the rhythm of his breathing. "That was his," Harlan said, and didn't explain further. The truck was parked behind the diner in a space concealed by a wooden fence and a dumpster. It was a Ford, older than the Chevy, black paint gone gray with oxidation, but when Harlan turned the key, the engine caught immediately and ran smooth, maintained, cared for, kept ready by someone who understood that the difference between escape and capture is often the difference between an engine that starts and one that doesn't. They pulled out of the lot with the headlights off, following the road by memory and moonlight. Harlan drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on his cane, which he had wedged between the seat and the center console like a weapon in a holster. "Where are we going?" Eli asked. "Rally Point, 6 miles east, old grain elevator off Palmer Road. If Graves got out, that's where he'll head. If he didn't," Harlan stopped, his jaw tightened. "If he didn't, that's where the others will gather." "What others?" "Kid, you've seen 9 people. The Iron Saints have 42 members spread across 3 counties. When word goes out, they come. That's not a choice. That's what the patch means." Eli looked out the window at the darkness rushing past. No streetlights out here. No houses. Just the black shapes of trees against a sky that was one shade lighter than black, and the faint silver line of the road unspooling ahead of them like a thread being pulled from something that was unraveling. "Tell me about the trafficking," Eli said. Harlan's hands shifted on the wheel. The truck didn't swerve, didn't change speed, but the atmosphere inside the cab changed the way air changes before a storm. A drop in pressure, a tightening, the smell of something coming that you can't see yet. "I don't know the details. Graves found evidence at the facility. Transport trailers fitted with hidden compartments. Surveillance footage showing people being moved in and out. Not livestock. People." "For how long?" "Based on what he described, years. Maybe longer." "And Silas found out. Silas found out 7 years before anyone else. He tried to tell us. Graves told him to drop it. Graves was wrong." The admission was delivered without bitterness, without accusation, without any of the emotional ornamentation that most people use to decorate their acknowledgement of failure. Harlan said it the way you say the sky is gray, as a fact that exists regardless of your feelings about it. "Graves has been carrying that for 8 years, Harlan continued. The knowledge that he told a good man to stand down, and the good man didn't, and the good man paid for it, or that's what we thought, that he paid for it. But he didn't die. He didn't die. He went in, alone, without backup, without support, without anyone knowing. He faked his death, or someone faked it for him. And he spent 8 years inside whatever that operation is, gathering evidence, protecting victims when he could, surviving. Harlan's voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, not theatrically. Just a hairline fracture in the stone of his composure, visible for a moment and then sealed shut. 8 years, he said again, quieter. I can't even imagine what that did to him. The grain elevator appeared out of the darkness like a monument to something that had stopped mattering. Tall, narrow, built from concrete and corrugated metal, it stood at the edge of a field that hadn't been planted in years. The gravel lot around it was empty except for 2 motorcycles parked in the shadow of the building's eastern wall, engines off, chrome reflecting what little moonlight broke through the clouds. Harlan pulled the truck behind the elevator and killed the engine. He didn't get out immediately. He sat there, listening. Eli listened too, and heard nothing at first, just wind and silence and the tick of the cooling engine. Then, faintly, the sound of voices, low, controlled, coming from inside the building. They entered through a side door that groaned on its hinges. The interior was vast and hollow, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above them, the floor covered in old grain dust that muffled their footsteps. A single battery-powered lantern sat on an overturned crate in the center of the space, casting a circle of yellow light that made everything outside its reach look like it had been erased. 2 men stood in the light. One was Deck. He was bleeding. A cut above his left eyebrow was sending a thin line of blood down the side of his face, curving along his cheekbone and dripping off his jaw onto the collar of his jacket. He wasn't wiping it away. He was standing with both hands braced on the crate, leaning forward, his breathing audible across the entire space, heavy, ragged, the breathing of a man who had been running and hadn't fully stopped. The other man was someone Eli didn't recognize. Younger than Deck, maybe late 20s, with a beard that was more neglect than choice, and hands that were shaking badly enough to make the cigarette between his fingers scatter ash in a pattern that looked like Morse code. "Where's Graves?" Harlan asked. Deck looked up. The blood on his face caught the lantern light and turned it into something that looked painted, deliberate, almost artistic, except for the fact that the canvas was human and the medium was real. "Still out there," Deck said. "And Stone?" "With him. They got pinned near the east perimeter when the spotlights hit. I drew fire and cut through the fence on the south side. Lost the bike in a drainage ditch a mile out. Cole picked me up." The younger man, Cole, nodded without speaking. His cigarette had burned down to the filter. He didn't notice. "How many at the facility?" Harlan asked. "More than we expected. 20, maybe 25, armed, professional. This isn't local. This is organized. The equipment, the vehicles, the security protocols. This is a funded operation with infrastructure." "Federal?" Deck shook his head. "Not government. Private. Corporate. The kind of money that hires ex-military for perimeter security and installs camera systems that cost more than everything in this building combined." Eli stood at the edge of the light, listening. The jacket he was wearing, Silas's jacket, hung past his fingertips, and he had shoved his hands into the pockets to keep them from shaking. His right hand found something in the pocket, a piece of paper folded small, wedged into the corner of the lining. He left it there. This wasn't the moment. "Tell me about the footage," Harlan said. Deck straightened up. He reached for a rag that was sitting on the crate and pressed it against the cut on his forehead, wincing at the contact. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Lower. Harder. The voice of a man delivering a report he wished he didn't have to give. "The footage is from internal security cameras, hallway feeds, loading dock angles, storage areas. The files go back at least 5 years. I didn't have time to scrub through everything, but what I saw..." He stopped. He pressed the rag harder against the wound and closed his eyes. "What did you see?" Harlan asked. "People, in the trailers, locked in. Some of them were kids." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. It pressed against the walls of the grain elevator and pushed against the ceiling and settled onto every surface like dust made of something heavier than dust. Cole dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot, and then stood there looking at the ground as if the concrete might open up and give him somewhere to put what he was feeling. Eli felt the air leave his lungs. Not suddenly, not like a punch, but slowly, the way air leaves a tire with a slow leak. The kind where you don't notice you're flat until you try to move and realize you've been sinking for miles. Kids. He had been one of those kids. Not trafficked, not locked in trailers, but abandoned, moved, processed, filed, forgotten. He knew what it felt like to be cargo. He knew the specific weight of being transported from one place to another by people who saw you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. How many? He heard himself ask. Deck opened his eyes and looked at him. For the first time since Eli had met him, the big man's expression held something other than professional blankness. It held rage. The deep structural kind that doesn't burn hot but burns continuous, like an underground fire that can smolder for years without ever reaching the surface. On the footage I saw? Dozens. Over 5 years? Hundreds. Maybe more. And Silas was in there the whole time? The footage from the last 6 months shows him. Different areas of the facility. Sometimes moving freely, sometimes not. The most recent clip, 3 weeks old and yet, shows him in a maintenance corridor. He's limping. His left arm is in a makeshift sling, and he's carrying something. What? A hard drive. External. Small enough to hide. He was moving through a section of the building that didn't have cameras, except it did. A hidden camera he didn't know about. The footage shows him pulling files, copying records. He's building a case, Harlan said. He's been building a case for 8 years, Deck said, alone, from the inside, with no backup, no extraction plan, and no way to get the evidence out, until he found a way to put his patch on a fence where someone would find it. Eli's hand tightened around the piece of paper in the jacket pocket. He could feel its edges through the fabric, sharp, deliberate, folded with the precision of someone who understood that small things survive when large things don't. He pulled it out. It was a piece of paper torn from something thicker, a notebook maybe, or a manual. On it, in handwriting so small and tight it looked like code, were 2 columns of numbers separated by dashes and forward slashes. Dates, names, locations. Not many, maybe 12 entries, but each one was written with the kind of deliberate clarity that comes from knowing that what you're recording matters more than your safety. Harlan, Eli said. The old man turned. Eli held up the paper. This was in the jacket pocket, Silas's jacket. Harlan took the paper and held it under the lantern. His eyes moved across the entries, and Eli watched the color drain from his face the way water drains from a sink, not suddenly, but inevitably, following gravity toward a place it can't come back from. What is it? Deck asked. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He read the paper twice, 3 times, his lips moving silently as he processed each line. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his own pocket, and when he looked up, his pale blue eyes had gone dark. It's a list, he said. Transport dates, origin points, destination codes, and names. 12 names of people who facilitated the shipments. Anyone we know? Harlan looked at Deck. Number 7 on the list, he said. The name is Whelan. The grain elevator went silent. Somewhere outside, the wind pushed against the corrugated walls, and the metal groaned like a wounded animal. Tom Whelan, Deck said. Tom Whelan. Eli looked from Harlan to Deck and back. He didn't know the name, but he knew the reaction, the way both men's bodies had changed in the same instant, the sudden rigidity, the held breath, the involuntary clenching of hands that told him this name wasn't just familiar. It was family. Who's Tom Whelan? Eli asked. Deck sat down on the crate. He sat the way a man sits when his legs stop working. Not gradually, not with control, but all at once his body surrendering to a weight his muscles could no longer support. Tom Whelan is Iron Saints, Deck said. Charter member, rode with us for 20 years. He handles the club's legal affairs, registrations, property titles, liability contracts. He's the one who processed Silas's death certificate. He's the one who arranged the dental records with the coroner. The implication assembled itself in Eli's mind like a machine being built from scattered parts. Each piece clicked into place with a precision that felt mechanical, inevitable, the kind of logic that only works in one direction. Whelan had handled the dental records. Whelan had arranged the identification. Whelan had processed the death certificate. Whelan had made sure that when the Iron Saints buried their brother, nobody questioned what was in the box, because Whelan had known the box was empty. "He sold him," Stone's voice said from the darkness. Everyone turned. Stone was standing in the side doorway of the elevator, and behind her, leaning against the frame with one hand pressed to his ribs and blood on the front of his shirt, was Graves. They looked like they had crawled through a war. Stone's jacket was torn along the left sleeve, exposing a gash on her forearm that she had wrapped with a strip of fabric ripped from her own shirt. Her hair was matted with sweat and dirt and something darker. Graves was worse. His vest was ripped at the shoulder, and the way he was standing, tilted, braced, each breath measured and deliberate, told Eli that something beneath the shirt was damaged in a way that breathing didn't agree with. But his eyes were alive, more than alive. They were burning with the particular fire that comes when a man who has spent years blaming himself discovers that the blame belongs somewhere else entirely. "Whelan didn't just facilitate the shipments," Graves said, stepping into the light. "Each step cost him something." Eli could see the price being paid in the tightening of his jaw, the whitening of his knuckles where he gripped his own side. He built the pipeline, the trucks, the routes, the schedules. All of it ran through the club's logistics. He used our transport contacts, our road network, our connections to move people through 3 states without leaving a trace. "Using us," Dex said. "Using us. Using everything we built. Every route Silas mapped for parts deliveries, every contact we established for charity runs, every county road we maintained for our own travel. Whelan repurposed all of it. We were the infrastructure. We just didn't know." The rage in the room was palpable, not loud, not explosive, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need to shout because it has already decided what it's going to do and is simply waiting for the mechanics of the moment to catch up with the decision. "How did you get out?" Harlan asked. Stone answered. "When the spotlights hit, we split. Graves went east, I went south. I ran into a patrol. 2 men, automatic weapons, night vision. I went through a drainage pipe that came out on the other side of the perimeter fence. Graves..." She looked at him. "I went through the building," Graves said. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Not around, not over, through. "The building has a basement level," Graves continued. "The surveillance room is down there. That's where the servers are. That's where I saw the footage, live feeds from every camera in the facility. And that's where I saw Silas." His voice changed when he said the name. Not softer, not louder, deeper, as if the word had to travel further to get out. "He's in a room on the north end of the complex, a maintenance bay that's been converted into a cell. He has a cot, a bucket, and a chain on his left ankle that's bolted to the floor. The hard drive Dex saw on the footage. It's hidden somewhere in that room. He's been collecting evidence one piece at a time, smuggling files from the operation's own records, compiling it onto a single device." "For 8 years, Harlan said. "For 8 years. Alone. In a building full of people who would kill him if they knew what he was doing. And the only reason they've kept him alive is because he's useful. He's their mechanic. He maintains the fleet. The refrigerated trailers, the generators, the security vehicles. He keeps everything running because that's the one skill that makes him too valuable to dispose of." Graves leaned against a support beam and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, Eli saw something he had never seen in the man's face before. Not fear, not anger, guilt. The deep corrosive kind that doesn't attack from the outside but eats through from the center. The way rust eats through steel, invisible until the structure fails. "I told him to drop it," Graves said, 7 years ago. He came to me with evidence, suspicions, names. He asked for backup. He asked for the club to look into what was happening on those routes. And I told him to stand down because I didn't want to start a war with people who had more money and more firepower than we could match. You made a call, Stone said. I made the wrong call, and he went in alone because I failed him. He spent 8 years in a cage because I was afraid of a fight I should have had. Graves, don't. The word cut through the air like a blade laid flat. Don't tell me it wasn't my fault. Don't tell me I couldn't have known. I'm not interested in comfort right now. I'm interested in getting him out. He pushed off the beam and stood upright, and the cost of that motion was written across his face in lines of pain that he didn't try to hide. Whelan needs to be contained before we move, Graves said. If he finds out what we know, he'll warn the operation and they'll relocate everything. The people, the evidence, Silas. We lose it all. Where is Whelan now? Deck asked. Home. 20 minutes from here, probably asleep in a house that Iron Saint's money helped pay for. I'll go, Deck said. No, I'll go. You're bleeding, and you've already been identified at the compound. Cole drives me. Deck and Stone stay here and start calling every member we have. Full mobilization, no exceptions. Everyone rides tomorrow night. And the kid? Stone asked. Graves turned to Eli. The boy was standing in the circle of lantern light wearing a dead man's jacket that was 2 sizes too big, with a piece of paper in his pocket that could dismantle a criminal empire, and on his face was an expression that Graves recognized because he had worn it himself, a long time ago, in a different war, in a different darkness. The expression of someone who has nothing left to lose and has just realized that this is not a weakness. It is the most dangerous thing a person can be. You found the patch, Graves said. You found the list. You've seen things and heard things that make you a target whether you're involved or not. So I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Eli waited. If I leave you here tonight, and everything goes wrong, and the people running that operation come looking for you, what do you do? Eli didn't hesitate. I run. I get to a phone. I call every number Harlan called tonight. And I don't stop running until someone answers. Graves looked at him for a long time. The lantern flickered. Shadows moved across the walls of the grain elevator like ghosts rehearsing for something they hadn't decided to do yet. Wrong answer, Graves said. Eli blinked. You don't run, Graves said. You ride. Stone, give him the keys to Cole's backup, the Sportster in the shed behind the iron lantern. He's 17. Stone said. I was 16 the first time I rode. He's not you. No, he's the kid who walked 4 miles to return a dead man's patch to a room full of strangers. He's braver than I was. Stone looked at Eli. Her dark eyes measured him the way a carpenter measures a board, not with doubt, but with the precision of someone who needs to know exactly what they're working with before they commit to the cut. Can you ride? She asked. No. Then you'll learn tonight. The next 90 minutes were the most physically painful of Eli's life. Stone taught him on a Harley Sportster 883 that was smaller than the other bikes, but still felt like sitting on an earthquake. In the gravel lot behind the grain elevator, under a sky that had finally decided to rain, she walked him through throttle control, braking, clutch engagement, and balance with the methodical patience of someone who had taught this before and understood that muscle memory can't be rushed. He dropped the bike twice. The first time, the handlebar caught him in the ribs and he lay in the gravel for 10 seconds, rain hitting his face, the weight of the machine pressing against his right leg like a question he couldn't answer. Stone stood over him without offering a hand. Get up, she said. He got up. The second time, the rear wheel slid on wet gravel, and the bike went out from under him sideways. He hit the ground with his shoulder and felt something pop that wasn't a bone, but wasn't nothing either. He lay there staring at the sky, rain filling his eyes, Silas's jacket soaking through. Get up, Stone said. He got up. By the third attempt, something changed. Not skill, that would take months, but understanding. The machine wasn't fighting him. It was waiting for him to stop fighting it. When he relaxed his grip on the handlebars and let his body follow the bike's center of gravity, instead of trying to impose his own, the The Sportster steadied beneath him like an animal that had finally decided to trust its rider. He rode 100 yards in a straight line. Then he turned. Then he rode back. Stone nodded. One nod. Nothing more. "You won't be fast," she said, "and you won't be smooth, but if you need to move, you can move." Eli sat on the idling Sportster with rain running down his face and his hands vibrating against the grips, and he understood that something fundamental had changed. Not in the world. In him. He had walked into the Iron Lantern 24 hours ago as a boy who repaired fences for $40. He was sitting on a motorcycle now, wearing a dead man's jacket with evidence in the pocket, learning to ride from a woman who carried a name she had earned instead of one she was given. He wasn't the same person anymore. He wasn't sure he wanted to be. Graves returned at 3 in the morning. The green Chevy pulled into the lot and he stepped out, and the look on his face told everyone everything they needed to know before he opened his mouth. "Whelan's gone," he said. "House is empty. Closet's cleared out. Safe behind the bookshelf is open and cleaned. He's been gone for hours." "He knew," Stone said. "Someone told him. Someone in our network heard the calls tonight and got to Whelan before we did." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the metal roof of the elevator in a rhythm that sounded like counting. Graves stood in the open doorway, water running off his leather vest. His face lit by the lantern from inside, and the headlights from outside, caught between two kinds of light and belonging to neither. "There's a second name on that list that I recognize," he said. "I didn't want to say it in front of everyone, but you need to know." He looked at Harlan. "Number 11, he said. "The name is Cross." Nobody moved. "My brother?" Graves said. "My younger brother, Marcus. He's been facilitating routes through the Eastern Corridor for at least 3 years." Harlan closed his eyes. Deck put both hands flat on the crate and lowered his head between them. Stone turned away from the group and faced the wall, and Eli saw her shoulders rise and fall once in a breath that carried the weight of something being released and something else being accepted in its place. Graves stood in the rain and let it hit him. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't move. He stood there the way a man stands at the edge of something he can't walk away from and can't walk toward, the exact midpoint between the person he was and the person he is about to become. "We go tomorrow night," he said. "Every rider, full force. We hit that compound, we get Silas out, we recover the evidence, and we burn the operation to the ground." "And Whelan?" Deck asked. "Whelan will surface. People who run always do." "And Marcus?" Graves looked at the rain falling beyond the doorway. The drops caught the headlight beams and turned silver for an instant before they disappeared into the mud, bright and then gone. Temporary in the way that everything is temporary when you finally see it clearly. "Marcus made his choice," Graves said. "Now I make mine." He turned back to the group. His eyes found Eli last, and in them the boy saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The image of a man standing at the exact moment when loyalty to family and loyalty to what is right split apart like a road forking in the dark, and the man choosing the fork that leads away from everything he has ever known and toward everything he is afraid of becoming. "Everyone rides," Graves said. "No exceptions." And in the belly of an abandoned grain elevator, surrounded by men and women who had just learned that the enemy was not outside their brotherhood, but woven into its foundations, Eli Mercer zipped up a dead man's jacket, gripped the handlebars of a motorcycle he had learned to ride 90 minutes ago, and felt the rain hit his face like a baptism performed by no one, blessed by nothing, sanctified only by the choice to keep moving when every rational voice in the world was telling him to stop. They spent the day preparing to go to war, not the kind of war that governments declare with press conferences and televised speeches, the kind that starts in the gut of a man who has just learned that his own brother helped enslave people for profit, and spreads outward through a network of writers who understand that some debts can only be paid in person, in the dark, on roads that don't appear on any map. The grain elevator became a command post. By noon, 23 Iron Saints had arrived, on bikes and trucks, in a windowless van that one of them used for hauling engine parts. They came from across 3 counties, some of them still wearing the clothes they had been sleeping in when the calls came, some of them carrying equipment that Eli didn't have names for, but understood the purpose of the way you understand the purpose of a clenched fist, even if nobody explains it. Graves stood at the center of the space with a county map spread across 2 crates pushed together, held down at the corners with a socket wrench, a coffee thermos, a flashlight, and a box of ammunition. His ribs were taped beneath his shirt. Stone had done it at dawn with medical tape, and a competence that suggested she had done it before, in worse conditions for people in worse shape. And every breath he took was a negotiation between necessity and pain. "The compound has 3 access points," he said. His voice carried across the elevator without effort, flat and hard, and stripped of everything except information. "Main gate, north side. Service entrance, east side. Emergency exit, south wall, concealed behind a concrete barrier. The perimeter fence is 12 feet, chain link, topped with razor wire. Camera coverage on the north and east. Blind spot on the south where the drainage system runs under the fence." He pointed to positions on the map. His finger was steady. His hand was not. "Team 1 takes the main gate. Loud, visible, every headlight on. You're the distraction. They need to believe the full force is coming through the front. Team 2 goes through the drainage system on the south side. 4 riders, light, fast. Your job is to reach the north building where Silas is being held. Team 3 holds the perimeter on the east. Nobody leaves. Nobody gets to the transport trailers. If they try to move the victims, you stop them." "How?" someone asked. "However you have to." The room absorbed this. 23 faces in varying stages of exhaustion and determination, lit by lantern light and the gray daylight seeping through cracks in the elevator walls. Eli stood at the back, wearing Silas's jacket, feeling the list of names pressing against his ribs through the pocket lining like a second heartbeat. "Rules," Graves said. 1. We are not there to kill anyone. We are there to rescue hostages and preserve evidence. If force is necessary, it's defensive. We're not executioners." "And if they shoot first?" Deck asked. He was sitting on a crate with his head wound cleaned and butterflied, looking like a man who had been hit by a truck and then decided the truck owed him an apology. "Then you do what you have to do to survive. But every round you fire is a question you'll have to answer later. Make sure you can live with the answers." 2. The hard drive is the priority after the hostages. Silas has been building that evidence for 8 years. It's the only thing that can bring this operation down permanently. Without it, they relocate, rebrand, and start again in another county with another set of trailers and another set of victims. 3. Whelan and Marcus Cross are not targets. If you see them, you contain them. You don't touch them. I handle both of them personally. The way he said personally made the air in the room change temperature. "Questions," Graves said. Stone raised her hand. Not all the way, halfway, like she was measuring something. "What about the kid?" 23 heads turned to look at Eli. He felt the weight of every pair of eyes like individual points of pressure, each one carrying its own version of the same question. "The kid rides with Team 2, Graves said. The room erupted. Not with shouts. The Iron Saints didn't shout during operational briefings, but with the controlled, urgent objections of people who had spent their lives managing risk and could see a variable that didn't belong in the equation. "He learned to ride 12 hours ago. He's 17. He's a civilian. He's the only person Silas has never seen," Graves said, and the room went quiet. "If we breach the north building and Silas doesn't recognize us, if his mind has gone somewhere that 8 years of captivity takes a mind, he might fight us. He might run. He might not trust anyone wearing an Iron Saints patch because the last Iron Saint he trusted was Whelan, and Whelan sold him." Graves looked at Eli. "But he won't fight a kid. He won't run from a 17-year-old wearing his own jacket, carrying his own handwriting in the pocket. If everything else fails, Eli is the one variable that Silas's captors didn't plan for, because nobody plans for a kid who walks 4 miles to do the right thing." The objections died, not because they were answered, but because the logic was undeniable in the specific, terrible way that wartime logic is always undeniable. It makes sense precisely because nothing about the situation makes sense. Eli nodded. He didn't trust his voice to do anything useful if he opened his mouth, so he just nodded, And Graves nodded back, and something was sealed between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have required admitting that they were both afraid. The hours bled away. Eli sat outside the elevator on an overturned bucket, watching riders check their bikes with the methodical focus of surgeons preparing instruments. Oil levels, tire pressure, chain tension, headlight alignment. Each motorcycle was inspected with a care that went beyond maintenance into something that looked almost like reverence. The understanding that the machine you're sitting on might be the difference between getting home and not getting home, and that the time you spend with it now is the last conversation you might have. Stone found him there at 4 in the afternoon, the light already starting to weaken, the clouds dropping lower as if the sky was trying to press everything flat. She sat down beside him on the gravel. She didn't say anything for a long time. They watched the riders work, listened to the sound of wrenches and air compressors, and the occasional bark of an engine being test-fired, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling because it's already full. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. "I know. Nobody would think less of you. I would." She looked at him. The gash on her arm had been properly bandaged now, white gauze showing beneath the rolled cuff of her jacket. Her dark eyes held the same depth they always did, but there was something else in them now. Something that looked like worry, which Eli had never seen on her face before, and which made his chest tighten in a way he didn't expect. "I lost a son," she said. Eli turned to look at her. Her face was aimed at the parking lot, at the motorcycles, at a point somewhere beyond all of it. "He was 6. Accident on the highway. Drunk driver crossed the median. My husband was driving. He survived. My son didn't. My husband left 3 months later because he couldn't look at me without seeing the empty car seat, and I couldn't look at him without doing the math on how many seconds different the outcome would have been if he'd taken the other road." She said all of this in the same flat, controlled voice she used for everything. Coordinates, threat assessments, directions. As if the content didn't matter. As if she was reading numbers off a page. But Eli had spent his life listening to what people said underneath the things they actually said, and underneath Stone's words was a sound like a cable under tension, humming at a frequency that was just barely below the threshold of breaking. "That's why I ride with the saints," she said. "Not for the brotherhood. Not for the patches or the roads or the family dinners. I ride because when I'm on a bike, the only thing that matters is the next turn, the next mile, the next breath. Everything else, the math, the car seat, the 3 months, it all falls behind, and as long as I keep moving, it can't catch up." She looked at him. "But tonight I need you to come back. I need the kid who walked 4 miles to come back, because I have buried enough people I care about, and I'm not burying another one." Eli looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, from the sudden, overwhelming weight of being someone that another person needed to survive. He had spent 17 years being disposable, being temporary, being the kind of person who could vanish from a room and leave no impression on the air. And now a woman he had known for 2 days was telling him that his survival mattered to her with the same urgency that oxygen matters to fire. "I'll come back," he said. "Promise me." "I don't make promises. People break them." "I don't." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll come back," he said again, and this time it wasn't a statement. It was something heavier, something that carried obligation and weight, and the specific gravity of a word given to someone who had earned it. Stone nodded. She stood up, brushed gravel off her jeans, and walked away without looking back. Darkness came like a door closing. At 8:45, Graves called everyone in. The grain elevator filled with the sound of boots on concrete and the smell of leather and engine oil and cold air and the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline that no amount of experience can mask. 23 riders. 9 motorcycles for Team 1. 4 for Team 2. 3 trucks for Team 3 carrying equipment and med kits and enough bolt cutters to open every lock in the county. Graves stood in the lantern light one last time. His face was drawn, the skin tight over the bones, the bruising along his jawline turning purple-black in the shadows. He looked like a man who had been fighting something for days and was about to find out whether the fight had been worth it. Silas Kane has been inside that compound for 8 years, he said. He went in alone because I told him I wouldn't back him up. I was wrong. Tonight, we correct that. Tonight, nobody rides alone. He reached into his vest and pulled out the blood-stained patch. He held it up, and the lantern light caught the dried blood and the torn insignia and the wings that had been separated from the wrenches by a rip that ran through the center like a wound. "This goes back to its owner tonight," Graves said. "That's the only objective that matters." He put the patch back inside his vest, against his chest, over his heart. "Ride out." The motorcycles hit the road like thunder made physical. 9 bikes in formation, headlights cutting through the darkness, engines shaking the air in a frequency that Eli felt in his teeth. He rode behind Stone on the Sportster, following the taillights of the 3 other Team 2 riders down a service road that ran parallel to the main route, hidden by trees and elevation changes that kept them invisible to anyone watching the primary approach. The rain had stopped, but the roads were still wet, and the tires hissed against the asphalt in a continuous whisper that sounded like the world trying to tell them something they couldn't quite hear. They split from Team 1 at a crossroads 3 miles from the compound. The 9 bikes of Team 1 continued north, their engines growing louder as they accelerated, the sound building toward a crescendo that would reach the compound's front gate like a wall of noise designed to make every guard look in one direction. Team 2 went dark. Stone killed her headlight. The 3 bikes behind her did the same. They rode by moonlight and GPS and the particular intuition of people who have spent enough time on roads at night to read the darkness the way others read signs. Eli gripped the handlebars of the Sportster and followed Stone's taillights, the only light he allowed himself, and felt the wind push against his chest like a hand trying to hold him back. The compound appeared below them as they crested a ridge. From above, it looked industrial, a cluster of buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing, floodlights at the corners, a gravel yard filled with trailers and trucks parked in rows that looked military in their precision. The main building was long and flat-roofed, with smaller structures branching off it like ribs from a spine. Beyond the east wall, Eli could see the loading docks where the refrigerated trailers sat, their units still running, condensation pooling beneath them in the cold air. A sound reached them from the north. Engines, getting louder, Team 1 approaching. Stone held up a closed fist. "Stop." They waited on the ridge, 4 bikes, 4 riders, hidden behind scrub brush and darkness. Below them, Eli watched the compound react to the approaching sound. Floodlights shifted. Figures moved between buildings. The main gate, a double-wide section of chain link on a motorized track, began to close. Then Team 1 hit. 9 motorcycles, all headlights blazing, roared toward the main gate in a wedge formation that split the darkness like a blade. The sound was enormous, not just volume, but density. The layered roar of 9 engines running at full throttle, creating a wall of noise that made the floodlights seem dim by comparison. They didn't hit the gate. They stopped 50 yards short, fanning out across the access road, engines screaming, headlights aimed at the guard posts like searchlights. Every eye in the compound turned north. "Now," Stone said. They descended the ridge on foot, pushing the bikes down a deer trail to the drainage culvert that ran beneath the south fence. The culvert was concrete, 2 feet in diameter, half filled with cold water that hit Eli's legs like a blade as he crawled through. His arms shook. His knees scraped against the concrete. Silas's jacket caught on a seam and tore at the shoulder, and the sound of the fabric ripping was louder in his ears than the engines above. He emerged on the other side, inside the perimeter, soaking wet, freezing, his hands numb against the ground. Stone was already up, moving low along the wall of the nearest building. Deck was behind Eli, one hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward with a pressure that said, "Move and don't stop, and I'm right here all at the same time." The north building was 200 yards away. They covered the distance in segments, building to building, shadow to shadow, using the noise from Team 1's distraction to mask their footsteps on gravel that would have given them away in silence. Eli could hear shouting from the north end, guards responding to the motorcycles, orders being barked into radios. The mechanical whine of the gate's motor fighting against something that Eli suspected Team 1 had wedged into its track. They reached the north building's service entrance, a metal door with a keypad lock. Deck stepped forward and pulled a device from his pocket. Something small, electronic, trailing wires, and pressed it against the keypad. 8 seconds. The lock clicked. The door opened. Inside was darkness and the smell of industrial chemicals and old concrete. They moved single file down a corridor lit by emergency exit signs that cast everything in a red glow that made the world look like it had been dipped in blood. Eli counted doors. 6 on the left. 4 on the right. All closed, all locked from the outside. Stone stopped at the 7th door on the left. She pressed her ear against it. Listened. Looked at Deck. Held up one finger. One person inside. Deck tried the handle. Locked. He pulled a crowbar from inside his jacket. Eli hadn't even known he was carrying it, and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. The metal groaned. The lock resisted. Deck put his weight into it, 240 pounds of muscle and determination, and 8 years of guilt compressed into a single mechanical motion. The door broke open. The room behind it was exactly what Graves had described. A maintenance bay converted into a cell. A cot against the far wall. A bucket in the corner. A chain running from a bolt in the concrete floor to a shackle on the left ankle of the man sitting on the edge of the cot. Silas Kane looked up. He was thinner than any of the photographs Eli had seen in the clubhouse. His face was drawn, the bones visible beneath skin that had gone gray from years without proper sunlight. His hair was longer, streaked with white at the temples, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested a break that had healed wrong. His hands were calloused, cracked, the hands of someone who had been working with machinery every day for years without rest. But his eyes were alert, sharp, alive in a way that contradicted everything else about his appearance, and terrified. He looked at Stone, at Deck, at the Iron Saints patches on their vests, and instead of relief, his face showed panic. He pressed back against the wall, and the chain on his ankle rattled against the concrete with a sound that was the most desolate thing Eli had ever heard. "No," Silas said. His voice was cracked, raw, the voice of someone who hadn't used it for conversation in months. "You can't be here. You can't—" "Silas," Stone said, "you don't understand. If they see you, if they know you're here—" "We know about the trafficking," Deck said. "We know about Whelan. We know everything." Silas's face collapsed, not into tears, into something worse than tears, a structural failure of the expression he had been holding in place for 8 years, the controlled, deliberate blankness of a man who had survived by convincing himself that rescue was impossible and that the only way forward was alone. "Whelan," he whispered, "we know. There are others, more names. I have the hard drive. We know. Where is it?" Silas looked at the wall above his cot, a section of concrete block that looked identical to every other section until you noticed that the mortar around one block was slightly different in color, newer, softer, applied by hand rather than machine. Deck moved to the wall and worked the block free. Behind it, in a cavity no larger than a shoebox, sat a black external hard drive wrapped in a plastic bag, sealed with electrical tape, protected from moisture and discovery by a man who understood that the evidence on it was worth more than his life. 8 years, Silas said. Every transport, every route, every name, every victim I could identify. Financial records, communication logs, everything. Deck took the hard drive and put it inside his jacket, against his chest, the same way Graves carried the blood-stained patch. Stone crouched beside Silas and looked at the chain on his ankle. The bolt cutters came out. The chain parted with a sound that was metallic and final and absolute, and when the shackle fell away from Silas's ankle, Eli saw the skin beneath it. Raw, scarred, worn down to something that didn't look like skin anymore, but like a record of every day spent in captivity, written in the language of metal against flesh. Silas stood up. His legs shook. His left arm hung motionless. He took one step and nearly fell, and Stone caught him, and for a moment they stood like that in the red emergency light, a woman who had lost her son, and a man who had lost his freedom, holding each other up because neither one could stand alone. "Can you walk?" Stone asked. "I've been waiting 8 years to walk out of here. I'll crawl if I have to." They moved. Back down the corridor, Eli in front, Stone supporting Silas, Deck at the rear with the crowbar in one hand and the other pressed against the hard drive inside his jacket. The sounds from outside were changing. The distraction at the north gate was escalating. Eli could hear more shouting, the sound of vehicle engines starting, the sharp crack of something that could have been a firecracker but wasn't. They reached the service entrance. Stone pushed the door open and the night air hit them, cold and wet and real. The compound yard was chaotic now. Floodlights sweeping in erratic patterns, guards running between buildings, a truck reversing toward the loading dock where the trailers were parked. The trailers. Eli looked at them and felt his stomach drop. The refrigeration units were still running. The doors were still locked. And somewhere inside those metal boxes, people were waiting in the dark, listening to the chaos outside, not knowing if it meant salvation or slaughter. "The trailers," Eli said. "We get Silas out first," Deck said. "There are people in there." "I know, but there are kids in there." The words stopped Deck cold. He looked at Eli, and the boy saw something shift in the big man's face, the calculation of a soldier being overridden by the recognition of a human being who has just been reminded of what the mission actually means. Stone looked at Silas. "How many?" "Last count, 32. 3 trailers. The third one, the one on the far left, has 11 children." The number landed like a physical impact. 11 children in a refrigerated trailer in the dark. On a night in late October in Montana where the temperature was already dropping below 40 and would hit 25 by dawn. "Deck," Stone said. "Radio Team 3. Tell them to move on the loading dock. Now. Every trailer, every lock, every door. Get them open." Deck keyed his radio. His voice was controlled, but the words came fast. "Team 3, loading dock. Priority 1. 3 trailers, 32 souls. Children in trailer 3. Move now. Move now." The response came back crackled but clear. Affirmative. Moving. They ran. Stone half-carried Silas across the yard, staying close to the buildings, using shadows and noise as cover. Eli ran beside them, his legs burning, his lungs on fire, Silas's jacket flapping around him like wings that couldn't quite lift him off the ground. Behind them, the sound of Team 3's trucks hitting the east perimeter drowned out everything else. Engines, voices, the crash of chain link being torn apart by vehicles that didn't slow down. They were 50 yards from the south fence when the floodlight found them. A beam of white light swept across the yard and locked onto their position, turning them into silhouettes against the gravel. Eli felt the light hit him like a weight, pressing him flat, exposing every detail of his body to whoever was behind the source. "Run," Stone said. They ran. Silas was limping badly now, his good arm wrapped around Stone's shoulders, his feet dragging against the ground. Deck dropped back and positioned himself between the group and the floodlight, his body a barrier of mass and intention. A voice came over a loudspeaker, distorted, amplified, commanding. "Stop where you are. Get on the ground, hands visible." Nobody stopped. Nobody got on the ground. A shot cracked through the air. Not close, 50 yards, maybe more, but close enough to hear the bullet's passage as a sharp whisper that cut through the noise of engines and shouting and the blood pounding in Eli's ears. Then the floodlight went out. Eli didn't know why. He didn't care. He ran. They all ran. Stone dragged Silas toward the drainage culvert, and Deck covered their retreat with his body and his crowbar, and the specific kind of courage that doesn't think about survival because it has already accepted the alternative. They reached the culvert. Stone went first, pulling Silas through the concrete pipe, the water soaking them both. Eli went next, his hands slipping on the wet surface, his knees screaming against the concrete. Deck came last, barely fitting, his shoulders scraping both sides of the pipe. They emerged on the other side of the fence, outside the perimeter, gasping, soaked, shaking. The motorcycles were where they had left them on the ridge. Stone got Silas onto the back of her bike, and the man wrapped his one good arm around her waist and pressed his face against her back. And Eli could see his shoulders shaking with something that wasn't cold, and wasn't fear, and wasn't pain, but was all three at once, and something else that didn't have a name, because no one had ever needed to name it before. Eli climbed onto the Sportster. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely grip the handlebars. He turned the key. The engine caught. The vibration ran through his body like an electric current, and for 1 second everything was still. The compound behind them, the darkness ahead of them, the space between what had happened and what was about to happen. And in that second, Eli felt something lock into place inside him, some final piece of a structure he had been building without knowing it. And the structure was this: he was no longer alone. He was terrified and soaking wet and 17 years old and riding a motorcycle he had learned to operate the night before. But he was not alone. They rode. Behind them, the compound erupted. Team 3 had reached the trailers. The sound of bolt cutters on padlocks carried across the distance like gunshots in reverse. The sound of things being opened instead of closed, freed instead of trapped. And then another sound, softer, carried on the wind like something too fragile to survive the distance, but surviving it anyway. Voices, dozens of them, coming from the trailers, speaking in languages Eli didn't recognize, calling out names he couldn't pronounce, crying with the specific sound that human beings make when they have been in the dark for so long that they had forgotten the dark would ever end. At the main gate, Graves heard the voices too. He was standing in the headlight beams of 9 motorcycles facing the compound's entrance when the sound reached him. He closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 second of absolute stillness in the middle of absolute chaos. Then he opened them, and the man who opened his eyes was not the same man who had closed them. He keyed his radio. Team 2 status. Stone's voice came back. We have him. Silas is out, hard drive secured, heading to rally point. Graves pressed the radio against his forehead. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Whatever he said was meant for no one but himself. A private transaction between the man he had been and the man he was becoming, settled in silence, witnessed by nobody. Then he lowered the radio and turned to the riders behind him. Hold the gate, he said. Nobody leaves this compound until every trailer is empty and every victim is safe. Nobody. And from the direction of the loading docks, cutting through the shouting and the engines and the crying and the chaos, came the sound of the last trailer door being opened, and the light that poured into the darkness inside it was not a floodlight or a headlight or a flashlight, but the simple, ordinary light of a Montana sky at 1:14 in the morning. And it was enough. The last trailer door opened at 1:27 in the morning. Inside, 11 children sat against the walls of a refrigerated container that had been running at 42 degrees for the past 6 hours. They were wrapped in whatever they had, thin blankets, each other's arms, the shared body heat of small people who had learned to survive by becoming smaller. The youngest was maybe 4. The oldest was 12. None of them spoke when the door opened. They just looked at the light with the particular expression of human beings who have forgotten what light means and are trying to remember. A woman from Team 3, a rider named Campos, who worked as an EMT in her civilian life, climbed into the trailer and knelt in front of the nearest child. She didn't speak. She just held out her hand, palm up, and waited. The child looked at the hand for a long time. Then, with the slow deliberation of someone making a decision that requires more courage than any adult in the parking lot could understand, the child reached out and took it. Campos helped them down one at a time, each child stepping from the metal floor of the trailer onto the gravel of the compound yard, blinking against the floodlights, shivering in the Montana cold. Other riders brought blankets from the trucks. Someone produced a box of granola bars. Someone else started a portable heater that cast a small circle of warmth in the vast darkness. And the children moved toward it, the way plants move toward sunlight. Not by choice, but by the deep cellular instinct to survive. Eli watched this from the ridge where Team 2 had regrouped. He was still on the Sportster, engine idling, his hands locked around the handlebars because he wasn't sure they would hold anything else. Silas was on the ground beside Stone's bike, sitting with his back against a rock, his chained ankle bleeding freely now that the shackle was gone. He was staring at the compound below with an expression Eli couldn't read. Not relief, not triumph, not any of the things you would expect from a man who had just been rescued from 8 years of captivity. Something older, quieter, the expression of someone watching the end of a story that had consumed their entire life and realizing that endings don't feel the way you imagined them when you were in the middle. Stone's radio crackled. South perimeter. We've got a runner. Black SUV heading east on the service road. No plates. Stone keyed the radio. Graves? I see it. From the ridge, Eli watched a single motorcycle break away from the formation at the main gate and tear across the compound yard toward the east road. The headlight cut a sharp line through the darkness, and the engine sound that followed it was different from the others. Deeper, angrier. The sound of a machine being pushed to the edge of what it could deliver by a rider who had stopped calculating risk. Graves. The SUV was 200 yards ahead, accelerating, its taillights bouncing on the uneven road. Inside, Eli knew without being told, was either Whelan or Marcus or both, the men whose names were on a list in the pocket of a dead man's jacket, running from the wreckage of an operation they had helped build on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. Graves closed the distance in 40 seconds. His bike ate the road with the single-minded hunger of a machine that had been built for exactly this, and when he pulled alongside the SUV on the driver's side, Eli could see, even from the ridge, even in the dark, the moment when the driver looked over and saw who was beside him. The SUV swerved. Graves swerved with it. Two vehicles moving at speed on a road that wasn't meant for speed, the headlight of the motorcycle and the taillights of the SUV painting red and white streaks across the Montana darkness, like an argument being held in light instead of words. Then the SUV braked. It stopped so suddenly that the rear wheels locked and the vehicle skidded sideways on the wet gravel, coming to rest at an angle across the road. Graves stopped 30 feet ahead, killed his engine, and swung off the bike in a single motion that was fluid and final and carried the weight of 8 years of guilt being converted into something that could actually be used. He walked toward the SUV. The driver's door opened. Tom Whelan stepped out. He was smaller than Eli expected. Average height, average build, wearing a quilted jacket and khakis and shoes that were meant for offices, not compound yards. His face was pale in the motorcycle's headlight, and his hands were raised to shoulder height, palms forward, in the universal gesture of a man who has run out of options and is trying to buy time with the only currency he has left: cooperation. Gideon, he said. Graves stopped 10 feet away. Don't, Graves said. The word was quiet, but carried the kind of finality that doesn't need volume because it has already decided everything that comes after it. Don't say my name. Don't talk to me like we know each other. You lost that right when you put a brother in chains. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. I've seen the trailers. I've seen the cameras. I've seen the children. And I've seen Silas. What's left of him? Whelan's hands dropped slightly. Something changed in his posture. The practiced confidence of a man who had spent 20 years navigating the space between legal and illegal deflating in real time, like a tire going flat on a road with no shoulder. I was going to bring it down from the inside, Whelan said. I was gathering evidence. You were making money. 3 years of facilitating routes. 3 years of knowing people were in those trailers and signing the paperwork that kept them moving. Don't insult me with a cover story. Silas was the one building a case. You were building a retirement fund. Whelan said nothing. His silence was its own confession, more complete than any words could have been. Where's Marcus? Graves asked. Whelan's eyes shifted to the passenger side of the SUV. The window was tinted, but in the headlight's glare, Eli could see a shadow in the seat. A figure sitting motionless, facing forward, not looking at anything. Graves walked to the passenger door and opened it. Marcus Cross was younger than his brother, late 30s with the same lean build and the same jaw, but softer, a version of Graves that had never been weathered by the same storms, never hardened by the same choices. He sat in the passenger seat with his hands in his lap and his eyes fixed on the dashboard, and he didn't look up when the door opened. "Marcus?" No response. "Look at me." Marcus turned his head. His eyes found his brother's face, and in the pale wash of the headlight, Eli saw something pass between them that was too large and too damaged for any single expression to contain: the wreckage of a relationship that had been built on shared blood and shared history and was now being measured against 32 people in refrigerated trailers, 11 of them children. "How long?" Graves asked. 3 years. "Did you know about Silas?" Marcus closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. "I didn't know he was alive. I didn't know about any of that. I just ran the routes. I moved the paperwork. You didn't look inside the trailers." "No?" "You didn't ask what you were moving." "I knew what I was moving." The admission fell between them like something dropped from a height. It hit the ground and shattered, and the pieces lay there in the headlight, visible and irreparable, and neither brother made a move to pick them up. Graves stood there for a long time. The wind pushed against his back. The compound behind them was still lit up, still noisy, still full of the sounds of people being rescued from darkness, and in front of him his younger brother sat in the passenger seat of a dead man's SUV, wet-eyed and broken, waiting for a judgment that only one person had the authority to deliver. "Get out of the vehicle," Graves said. Marcus got out. "Give me your phone." Marcus handed it over. "You're going to sit on the side of this road until federal investigators arrive. You're going to tell them everything, every route, every payment, every name. You're going to give them access to every account and every file and every piece of documentation you have. And you're going to do it not because I'm telling you to, but because you owe 32 people a debt that you can never fully pay, and this is the only down payment available." Marcus nodded. His face was the face of a man standing at the bottom of a well he had dug himself, looking up at the only light left, understanding that the climb out would take the rest of his life and that he would deserve every second of it. Graves turned away. He walked back to his motorcycle, straddled it, and sat there for a moment with his hands on the grips, looking at the road ahead. Then he reached inside his vest and pulled out the blood-stained patch and held it in his left hand. And Eli watched from the ridge as the man pressed it against his forehead and closed his eyes. And whatever happened in that silence was between Graves and the weight he had been carrying and the road that stretched out before him, dark and wet and empty, waiting for the decision that would determine whether he drove forward or drove back. He drove back. Federal investigators arrived at 4:12 in the morning. 3 vehicles, unmarked, carrying agents who had been monitoring the trafficking corridor for months without enough evidence to act. The hard drive changed that. Silas's 8 years of work, every transport, every financial transaction, every name, gave them everything they needed to dismantle the network from the inside out. The agents took control of the compound. The victims were moved to a processing center in the county seat, where medical teams and translators and social workers were waiting. The 11 children were separated from the adults and placed in a warming station that had been set up in a school gymnasium. And when Eli heard this detail, a gymnasium, he thought of every gymnasium he had ever sat in during foster care intake, waiting on a folding chair for someone to tell him where he would sleep that night. And the memory hit him so hard that he had to pull the Sportster over to the side of the road and sit there in the dark until his hand stopped shaking. Stone found him there. She pulled up beside him, killed her engine, and sat on her bike in the silence that followed. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't tell him it was going to be okay. She just sat there, breathing, existing, being present in the specific way that people who have survived their own darkness learn to be present for others who are still in theirs. "They'll take care of them," she said finally. "The system doesn't take care of anyone. This time it will. Because this time there are 42 people making sure it does." Eli looked at her. The bandage on her arm was soaked through. Her face was streaked with dirt and something that might have been tears, but might have been rain. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent years outrunning something that had finally stopped chasing her because she had turned around and faced it. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She nodded, and for a moment, just a moment, she reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. and the weight of it was exactly the weight of a hand on a shoulder, nothing more and nothing less, and it was enough. They rode to the Iron Lantern as the sky was turning from black to gray. The diner was lit from inside, every window glowing with a warmth that Eli could see from half a mile away. June had opened early. The coffee was ready. The kitchen was running. And inside, sitting in booths and at the counter and on chairs pulled from the back room, were the Iron Saints who had ridden through the night and the people they had brought back with them. Silas was in the last booth. The same booth where Graves had been sitting 2 days earlier when Eli walked in with a blood-stained patch and changed everything. He was wrapped in a blanket, an IV in his good arm. Campos had started it in the truck, and a plate of food in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was just sitting there, looking at the room, watching people move and talk and exist in a space that was warm and lit and safe, as if he was trying to remember what those things felt like after 8 years of cold and dark and chains. Graves sat across from him. They hadn't spoken yet. They had been sitting in that booth for 20 minutes, and neither of them had said a word. The silence between them was dense with everything that needed to be said. Apologies, explanations, recriminations, forgiveness, and dense with the understanding that words were not large enough to carry any of it. Finally, Graves reached inside his vest. He pulled out the patch, the blood-stained, torn, weathered piece of leather that had started everything. He set it on the table between them, the insignia facing up, the wings and wrenches visible beneath the dried blood. "This belongs to you," he said. Silas looked at the patch. His right hand moved toward it, stopped, moved again. When his fingers touched the leather, they trembled, not shaking, trembling, the same tremor Eli had seen in Graves's hands 2 nights ago, born not from fear, but from the specific vibration of touching something that connects you to the person you were before everything was taken away. He picked it up. He held it against his chest, and he closed his eyes. "You should have backed me," Silas said. His voice was barely audible, a whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "I know. I asked you to ride with me and you said no. I know. I spent 8 years in a room the size of a closet because you were afraid of a fight. I know." Silas opened his eyes. They were wet, but the tears didn't fall. They sat in his eyes like water behind a dam, held in place by 8 years of discipline and survival and the refusal to break in front of people who wanted him broken. "You came tonight," Silas said. "I came tonight. That matters. It doesn't change. I didn't say it changed anything. I said it matters. Those are different things." Graves absorbed this. His hands were flat on the table, the knuckles swollen, the veins prominent, the hands of a man who had spent the night breaking through doors and fences and the walls of his own failure. He looked at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I'll carry it," Graves said. "Whatever you need me to carry, for as long as it takes." Silas looked at the patch in his hands. Then he looked at the room, at the riders who had come for him, at June pouring coffee, at Campos changing a bandage on Deck's head, at Harlan sitting in his booth with his cane and his tea, and the quiet satisfaction of a man whose doubts had been vindicated at a cost he wished they hadn't. "You already are," Silas said. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were not a sequence of images set to music, fading into each other with the smooth transitions of a story wrapping itself up. They were slow, and they were hard, and they were real. Federal investigators dismantled the trafficking network using Silas's hard drive. 14 arrests in the first week, 23 more in the second. Yes, the operation had spanned 3 states, 4 shell companies, and a network of facilitators that included a county coroner who had falsified dental records, a property manager who had maintained the Greyhorn facility, and a logistics coordinator who had built the transport schedules on infrastructure that the Iron Saints had created for legitimate purposes and never knew had been repurposed. Tom Whelan was arrested at the Canadian border 3 days after the raid. He had made it as far as a gas station in Glacier County before the federal warrant caught up with him. He was charged with conspiracy, facilitation of human trafficking, fraud, and obstruction of justice. His trial would take 14 months. His sentence would take longer. Marcus Cross cooperated fully. He provided testimony, documentation, and access to financial records that accelerated the investigation by months. The prosecutors recommended leniency in exchange for his cooperation. Graves did not attend the hearing. He did not visit his brother in the county facility where he was held awaiting sentencing. He did not respond to the 3 letters Marcus sent, each one longer than the last, each one asking for something that Graves was not ready to give and might never be. Some debts cannot be paid with words. Some forgiveness cannot be scheduled. Graves understood this the way he understood engines, as a matter of mechanics rather than philosophy. The parts were broken. Repair would take time and work and the willingness to sit with the damage until you understood it well enough to fix it. He wasn't there yet. He might never be. But the door was not locked, and he knew where the key was, and for now, that was enough. Silas spent 3 weeks in the hospital. Malnutrition, a poorly healed fracture in his left arm that required surgical correction, nerve damage in his left ankle from the shackle, psychological evaluation that the doctors described using clinical language that Silas listened to with the patient tolerance of a man who had already diagnosed himself years ago and didn't need a professional to tell him what living in a cage does to a human mind. He would heal, not completely, not the way he was before, but enough to walk without the limp becoming permanent, enough to use his left hand for the mechanical work that had kept him alive, enough to ride again when the spring came and the roads dried and the Montana air turned from cold to cool to something that almost felt like warmth. The rescued victims were processed through federal channels. Reunifications happened slowly. Phone calls, DNA databases, embassy contacts. The grinding machinery of international bureaucracy applied to the problem of returning human beings to the lives they had been stolen from. Some reunifications were immediate. A mother in another state who had filed a missing persons report 2 years earlier and had been told to stop calling. A family overseas who had paid smugglers for safe passage and received nothing but silence. Each reunion was its own story, its own earthquake, its own private apocalypse of joy and grief, and the impossible work of rebuilding a life that someone else had demolished. The 11 children took the longest. Some had families to return to, some did not. The ones who did not entered a system that Eli knew intimately: foster care, state custody, the rotating machinery of placement and evaluation, and the perpetual grinding question of where a child belongs when the answer isn't obvious. Eli watched this process from a distance that was measured in feet but felt like miles. He stood in the hallway of the county social services office while caseworkers made phone calls and filed paperwork, and he felt the familiar architecture of the system closing around him: the fluorescent lights, the plastic chairs, the forms that reduced a human life to checkboxes and dates. And then Graves walked in. He walked into the county social services office at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon, wearing clean jeans and a flannel shirt and no leather vest, carrying a folder of documents that he had spent the past week assembling, with the help of a lawyer who owed the Iron Saints a favor and a social worker who owed them 3. He sat down across from Eli in a conference room with beige walls and a table that was bolted to the floor. "I've filed for emergency guardianship," he said. Eli stared at him. The process takes 60 to 90 days. Background check, home inspection, character references, the whole thing. Stone's already provided a statement. Harlan's provided 2. June offered to testify in person, which the caseworker said wasn't necessary but would probably help. I'm not adopting you. You're 17. In a year, you'll be a legal adult and you can do whatever you want. But for the next 12 months, you need a place to live that has working heat and a door that locks and someone on the other side of it who gives a damn whether you come home. Eli looked at the folder. It was thick. Pages and pages of legal language and court filings and the specific bureaucratic documentation that the system requires before it will allow one human being to take responsibility for another. Graves had not done this casually. He had done it the way he did everything, completely, methodically, with the understanding that the things worth doing are the things that require you to show up and keep showing up and never pretend that showing up is enough. "I'm not easy to live with," Eli said. "Neither am I." "I don't trust people." "Good. Trust is earned. I haven't earned it yet." What if it doesn't work? Graves looked at him across the beige table in the beige room under the fluorescent lights that made everything look temporary, and his gray eyes held the boy with a steadiness that Eli had never seen directed at him before. Not by a teacher, not by a social worker, not by any of the foster parents who had cycled through his life like seasons that couldn't decide whether to stay. Then we fix it, Graves said. That's what we do. We fix things. The guardianship was approved in 53 days. Eli moved into the spare room of Graves's house, a small ranch-style building on 4 acres east of town, with a garage that was bigger than the house and a workshop behind it that smelled like welding flux and chain oil and the specific complicated history of a man who had spent his life building things with his hands because his hands were the only part of him that didn't argue back. He didn't call it home. Not at first. He called it the house, or Graves's place, or just here, the way you refer to something you're afraid to name, because naming it would make losing it worse. But over time, over weeks and months of meals at the kitchen table, and mornings in the workshop, and evenings on the porch watching the sun go down behind the mountains, the word shifted. It softened. It lost its sharp edges and its escape routes and its built-in distance. And one afternoon in late January, when Stone asked him where he was headed after the club meeting, Eli said home without thinking about it, and the word came out so naturally that he didn't even notice what he had said until Stone smiled. The Iron Saints renovated the abandoned ranch property on Riddler Road, the same property where Eli had been repairing fences when he found the patch. They converted the barn into a workshop. They installed tools, lifts, welding stations, a full set of diagnostic equipment. They built a classroom in the old farmhouse and hired a retired mechanic from Billings to teach basic engine repair and maintenance. They called it the Kane Workshop, and the sign above the door was hand-painted by Silas himself, standing on a ladder with his repaired left arm, his grip shaky but his letters straight. The workshop was open to any teenager in the county who needed a place to go. No application required. No background check, no intake form or psychological evaluation or 60-day waiting period. You showed up, you learned, you worked, and when you left at the end of the day, someone told you they'd see you tomorrow, which was the simplest and most radical thing any of them had ever heard, because it meant someone expected them to come back. Eli was the first student. He learned engine diagnostics from Silas, who taught the way he fixed things. But go cherry. Quietly, precisely, with a patience that seemed impossible from a man who had spent 8 years in a cell, but which made perfect sense once you understood that patience wasn't something Silas practiced. It was something he had become. On a Saturday morning in early March, 6 months after a 17-year-old boy had pulled a blood-stained patch from a rusted fence, the damaged fence on Riddler Road was still standing. Not because anyone had finished repairing it. They hadn't. But because it had been left the way it was, posts leaning, wire sagging, the section where the patch had been snagged still bent outward like a hand that had opened and not yet closed. Inside the clubhouse, the repaired leather patch hung on the wall beneath a simple wooden plaque. The blood had been cleaned away. The tear had been stitched. The insignia, wings spread wide over crossed wrenches, was whole again. The way it had been before a man who wore it decided that some things are worth more than safety and rode into a darkness that lasted 8 years. The plaque read, "Some brothers disappear so others can be found." Silas had chosen the words himself. He had stood in front of the wall for a long time after the patch was hung, looking at it with the expression of a man seeing his own grave marker and deciding that it doesn't apply to him anymore. Then he had turned away and walked outside into the cold March air and climbed onto a motorcycle that Stone had rebuilt for him, an old Sportster, the same model Eli had learned to ride on, and started the engine. The sound filled the parking lot, then the road, then the valley. And on that Saturday morning, as motorcycles rumbled out of Black Creek and onto the highway that ran east toward the mountains, Graves watched Eli ride beside the club for the first time. Not in the back, not trailing behind, beside them, wearing a jacket that was no longer too big because he had grown into it, carrying nothing in the pockets because the list had been entered into evidence and the patch had been returned, and the only thing left was the shape of a boy's hand on the grip of a motorcycle, steady and sure and pointed forward. Not wearing a patch, he hadn't earned one, might never want one. That wasn't the point. The point was the road. The point was the riders beside him. The point was the sound of engines in the morning air, and the cold on his face, and the particular, specific, irreplaceable knowledge that the people around him would notice if he didn't come home. That was enough. That was everything. The motorcycles disappeared over the ridge, one by one, their engines fading into the distance like a conversation that doesn't need to end because everyone already knows what was said. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and straight and open, and the Montana sky above it was the color of steel turning to silver, and the sun was coming up.